Good afternoon, everyone. I'm William Martinson, the Chairman of the Executive Committee of the Association of Professional Heritage Practitioners. I would like to welcome everyone to APHP's 2024 Virtual Symposium titled Heritage Issues in Southern Africa's Changing Inner City Environments. It is APHP's view that heritage specialists should be meeting to discuss aspects of our profession, and this virtual symposium is our contribution towards keeping that discussion alive. We would particularly like to welcome our APHP members, as well as those who are involved in heritage administration, those who are students in the heritage field, and those with an informal interest in heritage. APHP Exco hopes all attendees will find the proceedings of interest. We would also hope that any non-members might consider joining the APHP now or in the future. The call for presentations noted that inner city environments are typically historic and that among the dilapidation, the abandonment, and the vandalism are some sites of major historical, architectural, and social significance. What should be done in such difficult urban environs is central to this symposium. Aspects of these issues will be addressed in the presentations this afternoon. At the outset, APHP Exco would like to record our thanks to Gavin McLachlan, an ex officio member of Exco who initiated and curated the symposium and liaised with all the speakers. Then our thanks are due to Alwyn Harlich-Jones, member of Exco, who will be hosting the proceedings. Our most grateful thanks are also due to the speakers, Dr. Stephen Townsend, Brian Wintermeyer, Agnes Shinin-Gayamwe, Helene Potgieter, and Brian McKechnie with Brendan Hart, all of whom have given generously of their time to prepare their talks and present today. In closing, I would like to note the following. APHP's Exco is still of the opinion that an in-person heritage conference should be held in the future, and this remains on our agenda. The issue of professionalisation continues to receive APHP's attention. Exco are now actively engaging with SARA regarding the way forward. This virtual symposium clearly depends on technology. We trust it runs smoothly, but request your understanding if there are issues. If you could all mute your microphones and turn off cameras to save bandwidth during the presentations. Please hold your questions till the end of each talk and use the raised hand icon in the Zoom menu. It would be much appreciated if everyone could fill in the attendance register set up on Google Forms. The link to the register appears in the Zoom chat, and the symposium will be recorded, and each talk will hopefully be available to view on APHP's YouTube channel on completion. Hope you enjoy the symposium. I will now hand over to our host, Alwyn Harlich-Jones. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Alwyn, I think you've muted your microphone.
Sorry, yes. Sorry, I'll just repeat that. I apologize. So thank you, William, for that welcome. And I'm Alwyn Harlich-Jones. I'm a member of the APHP Exco, and I would like to welcome everybody here this afternoon. I look forward to traveling down the road with you and enjoying the rich diversity of subjects which our speakers will be presenting today. So I just ask you of one thing, just relax and enjoy this afternoon. Again, I wish to thank the chairman, William, and also the APHP Exco who have made this symposium possible and who have facilitated the symposium. Again, I'll repeat a huge big thanks to Gavin McLachlan, who, as you heard, coordinated this program this afternoon. I've got one or two household requests before we commence. Speakers are limited to their presentations of 35 minutes. Please, speakers, stay to this time limit because we've got quite a packed program and we are required to close the symposium at 5:15. So, and as William quite rightly pointed out, please leave your questions till after each speaker. I will request then and open the floor to any questions, and please make them questions and not comments. So I think just before we proceed, I'd like to just leave you with a thought, and this is as follows: you don't stumble upon your heritage; it's there, just waiting to be explored and shared. And this is what we'll be sharing today: a rich serendipity of heritage experiences. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce the first presentation today, and that is Dr. Stephen Townsend. First of all, I'd like to just give a brief introduction. Dr. Townsend, Stephen Townsend, matriculated at Kimberley Boys High. He has a B.Arch at University of Cape Town, including 2 years at Delft Technical University in Netherlands, and a diploma in conservation studies at the University of Rome, and a PhD at UCT. He's got a vast work experience in the building industry and also the City of Cape Town in heritage and land usage management. He's also been in private practice, specializing in planning and conservation matters for 20 odd years. Being CEO of Heritage Western Cape for 2 years, and also a council member of the HWC. He currently serves on the panel of MEC's Appeals Tribunal. He's a membership of professional bodies in the heritage and architectural and planning discipline. So, he has established heritage knowledge and experience. His field of interest is legal and administrative system regulation development, and the making and enriching of settlements, and also the training and professionalization of heritage practice. So I'd like to now, with that, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Townsend and his presentation title being Heritage Issues in SA's Changing Inner City Environments, Decision Making in terms of the National Heritage Resources Act. With that, Dr. Townsend, would you proceed with your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Martin and Alvin. I haven't got a PowerPoint, so I'm going to leave have my video on, so you are stuck with looking at my face, and I hope you will get some clues, some additional clues from how I gesticulate or wave my hands as I go along. So it is a matter of, I think, as I think it was Owen who says, just enjoy it. Well, I hope this is not going to be enjoying. I hope this is going to be challenging rather, and even thought-provoking. But with that said, let me get on with it. I'm presuming that Grace did send me the list of participants, and I see that most of the participants here today are members of APHP, though there are quite a lot who are not. I am going to presume that everybody is, that we're all part of conservation, more than conservation lobby, but a group, a profession, an incipient profession that is increasingly engaged in making the environment. We come from a wide range of professions, from architecture, land survey, town planning, law, history, all sorts of things, and we play various roles in the processes of the legal processes of managing the heritage components of the environment. Those processes are complicated, and as I've said in the introduction, the outline, what we do is not popular very often with interested parties who are the claimants of heritage, because they don't always understand or agree. Those not mutually exclusive. They may be both. Neither understand and definitely don't agree with the decisions that are ultimately made. But as importantly, our other colleagues in the building or development industry, including the people who actually are investing large amounts of money in making the environment. So but what I'm talking about today, what I'm hoping to talk about are what our professional responsibilities are, and whether we satisfy them, particularly in the context of the inner city environment. Each town, each city has different let's say economic dimensions and different economic impulses that are driving development and driving the work that we are then asked to do, to be involved in. I do, in a way, what I'm saying today, I hope it to be something of a critique of what we have been doing the last couple of decades. My outline refers to the intrinsic difficulties of heritage management. And in particular in terms, and I'm going to be talking particularly about South Africa, that means therefore both, or especially the National Heritage Resources Act, but also in the context of a whole other set of laws, including planning bylaws, and particularly the Constitution, Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, etc. And that all makes up this complex legal framework within which we have to operate. Of these kind of intrinsic difficulties, which applies all over the world, the first essential difficulty is the identification of heritage. What are the subjects of management? What are the things, the heritage resources that are important enough to be managed? Those that are already identified in some way or other, either formally, or especially if they are formally identified through one of the sections in the Act, then we know what they are, and usually there is some understanding of why they have been declared and formally identified as heritage resources. And that part that's the first little step is an important one, because most of the parties who get involved in these processes then know what we're talking about. But these identification processes, both of those formally identified ones and the ones that are not formally identified, the ones that come up through Section 34 and Section 38 in particular. Section 34 are buildings older than 60 years, and Section 38 are a series of triggers. And those triggers are not heritage related, but are development related. And the process that of submitting of either applications or of impact assessments is the process for identifying significance, outlining significance, perhaps not outlining, more than outlining, giving a fairly detailed account of what the significance of a building or a place or an environment or parts of environment, and the aspects of different kinds of significances that make that thing or that place significant and regarded, and why that's regarded as a heritage resource. Now, all of what I've said already is very variable. The research that goes, the historical research, social impact or social significances, finding out about these things, giving some description of even of architecture, let alone of something as ephemeral as the sentiment of a group of people who live near or around, or perhaps even don't live near, what they regard as significant about this place. And those are the first. This is the first set of questions that are asked, or that must be asked, is what is the significance of the thing that is being considered and being looked at, or that is going to be affected by a development proposal of some sort, maybe to alter it, maybe to demolish it, it may be just to build next to it. But what is the question is, what is the significance? Do we do routinely, not routinely, yes, routinely, do we every time that a submission is made to the Heritage Authority, or to the authority that's going to make a decision, and that includes very often officials over the counter, who of course are part of what we're talking about, is that identification both of what kind of significance it is and the extent of significance. There are two steps here that very often are simply ignored. There's no detailed account of the significances, and there's no real account of the extent of significance. Now, of course, very often the argument will be, oh, it's been graded, and it is graded. It's a grade 3A, B, or C. And it seems to be left at that. Now, is that enough? And I would say definitely not. That may be a conclusion that one reaches at the end, and the useful part of that conclusion is because it helps in identifying the rigorousness with which the authorities may view the development proposal, but I do want to emphasize that the grading is not enough. Grading does not outline or even go near describing what kinds of significances there are. And the argument about how much significance, the degree of significance, it will depend on who's talking, on the different kinds of significances. A place may be very significant for one particular reason, but much less significant for other reasons. And that's why the necessity for differentiating between significances is so important. And this is just the first step. And my question is, do we do it? Do the applicants and then the officials who receive these applications do that adequately? And does the authority, or do the authorities then either agree, yes, that description of that account of significance is accepted, and that its argument about the extent of significance is also accepted, or do they say no, they don't agree? Now, I think that is pretty seldom done, and that makes it very difficult for people who are different from us, who are outside of the heritage management professions, to understand. Will an investor seriously consider investing where that kind of the rigorousness of what I've just described is not being followed, so they do not see the outline, they do not see the underpinning reasons for ultimate decisions. Now, I think that every application should include a clear statement of significance, and that means both the kinds of significances and the extent of significance, and the authority should either say they concur, or that they do not, and why not. Does that happen? No, it doesn't. Second, that's just the first step. The second step is there should also be an analysis, a careful analysis of the impact on that heritage significance. The applicant should outline such an assessment, and the authority should confirm or differ. And do this clearly, because without doing it clearly, the reasons for decisions then have to be sucked out of thumbs of other people by lawyers or by all of the parties who are interested, whether they're interested parties, professionals involved, or investors, or property owners of various kinds. So that assessment of impact on significance is the second step. The third step is, once we've defined and articulated significance in kind and degree, and we've outlined the impacts on the heritage, on the significance and on heritage, not on the building or on the environment, but on the building or environment as heritage. We must then take account of a whole lot of other things: social and economic rights, the additional sets of considerations regarding what else could be happening here, what should be happening here. Now, remember, we are talking about inner city environments today. We're not talking about unique heritage resources that need to be dealt with. We're talking about fairly complex and pieces of the city and of towns in which enormous amounts of money are already invested. So these impacts on other rights, on other responsibilities of the state. Of course, property rights are important, and there are a whole lot of other laws that I'll come to in a second. But we need to recognize that heritage resources cannot be judged on their own. They are part of, in this today we're talking about inner city environments, but they're always part of environments. So finally, after those three steps, we finally come to the fourth step, where we can actually talk about a decision, and we can talk about alternatives, we can talk about mitigations, and we can talk about refusals and approvals and conditions that would mitigate the damage on heritage, not on other things that may be good. We have to weigh up the good for heritage, the bad for heritage, the impact on heritage against other goods, other advantages, like weighing up the advantage of an impact of, let's say of a hospital or social housing, or perhaps a bus station, part of the process of looking after the city. How do we do these things? So all of these steps, each of these four steps I've now outlined, there are many variables within them, and there are very many disagreements amongst ourselves, let alone with people who are not within the heritage management environment. And they all have to understand this. So with these difficulties, we can see how difficult it must be for people from outside who do not see heritage as an enormously important thing, who see their property rights, or they see their investment, or they see their proposal of a hospital, or of social housing, or of whatever it may be, as being more important than, let's say, a lesser heritage significance. Those steps all have to be done for it to be rational. This significance, impacts on heritage significance, the weighing up of losses and benefits, What are in terms of against other goals, other rights? And then in that process, we have to, in particular, in this weighing up of this process, we must take account of other bits of law. Of course, property rights come out of section, I forget which section of the Constitution, but it's quite clear. The right to fair administrative justice, section 25 of the Constitution. But there's an interesting section which I haven't heard introduced very often into discussion about heritage, and that's section 36. Section 36 is essentially a series of conditions, issues that have to be taken into account in imposing any limitation, and therefore in making any decision other than a simple approval of what the person wants. Any kind of limitation imposed as a consequence of heritage authorities' protection of heritage is a limitation of a sort. And section 36 says what you have to do in weighing up the importance of heritage against other things. You also have to weigh up the nature of these rights, heritage against whatever rights. You have to weigh up, take account, look at the importance of the purpose of the limitation. You have to look at the nature and extent of the limitation. You have to look at the extension, at the relation between the limitation and the purpose. And then finally, you have to think of, are there any other less restrictive ways of achieving the management end, but permitting the other rights to be exercised? Now, that kind of exercise just isn't, we may do that intuitively or sort of implicitly. We may think in a sense of fairness that in a sense of balancing is not the right word. Please delete that bit. In weighing up these different things that have to be weighed up. It is a matter of weighing up and coming to a conclusion, and then coming to a conclusion as to whether you can achieve the heritage end, the heritage purpose, with something that would not affect in the same way. Now, that's all very difficult, and that's been made even more difficult in the last few years by two court cases. First, when the National Heritage Resources Act came into effect, it was presumed that restrictions could only be imposed on development applications to the extent that the restriction pertained to the building that was being affected, the building itself. And that made sense given the wording of the Act. But then in 2007, which is now 17 years ago, a court case called Collidental about a matter in Mossel Bay, an argument was made by an applicant the argument was made by Heritage Western Cape that the site was a big site, and a building built next to a building, obviously a heritage resource on the site, could also be restricted. It was through a development application affecting part of the building, and the Heritage Western Cape imposed a condition saying that you could not build whatever you wanted on the rest of the site. It was quite a big site, and the applicant argued that this was unconstitutional and it was stretching too far, etc., etc. But the ultimate conclusion was that yes, you could impose restrictions on a future building that could affect the heritage resource on that same site. That pertained from 2007 until 10 years later, 2017, when another important case came up, the case of Peter Gies. And in this case, the argument. This is a matter up in Vredehuk, not far from where I'm sitting in Cape Town, and the case there actually enabled it was a demolition application, and the court eventually argued, or not argued, the judgment had the effect that not only did you have to take account of the building that you were dealing with, the site that you were dealing with, but any new building that was going to be built on that site. You could demolish this building, but any new building had to take account of the heritage resources around it. And this was argued in this case that the environs of the immediate environs were a heritage resource, and to enjoy the ordinary rights of the zoning created by the zoning scheme would be damaging to that environment. And the court said, no, you can't do that. Or that, yes, the Heritage Authority must take account of damage to heritage, abutting heritage, and it could restrict the scale, the type of building, etc., in order to protect that heritage. That's now the last 7 years that's been the case, and it went to the Supreme Court of Appeal. So this is a judgment that reaches right across South Africa. Any heritage, any building that has been triggered by the Act, by any part of the Act, must take account of whether it damages other heritage. Now, that's a big stretch. This is not new. This is now for 7 years. This has been the case. And is this happening all over the country? Now, many of you participating today and listening to me are outside of Cape Town, outside of the Western Cape. And I know that these things are regulated and managed in quite different ways in different parts of South Africa. But they are all, if they do not take account of the Geese judgment, they are at risk. And heritage, the heritage claimants, people who claim that their heritage is damaged, could easily go to court and demand that these approvals be struck down. Of course, going to court is risky and costly, etc., etc. But that's how the law is constructed in South Africa at the moment. So and case law is the way in which, and particularly when it gets to Supreme Court of Appeal, that's the way in which the statutes are interpreted through case law. We don't have a lot of case law, but these two cases, the Qualidental and the Geese judgments, do have an effect everywhere. So, all that said, do we, as heritage practitioners and as officials, whether you're in a provincial heritage authority or in a state, in a municipality, or helping with land use management or whatever it is, and do we help our clients in all of this? Do we explain this adequately to both clients and colleagues, the land surveyors, the structural engineers, the architects? Do we make, and particularly to our clients, or to the clients, the property owner, the person who's setting out to exercise rights and to be part, and again, today I emphasize, part of inner city, the remaking of inner city environments. Do we do this? I don't think we do it adequately. But those steps are all necessary for them, for the decisions of the authorities. Do the authorities then, do the authorities' decisions and do their reasons adequately satisfy all of what I've just been through? I think that happens very seldom. And of course, I repeat, are we doing our job? Are we doing our job adequately? Are we taking the time to explain to our clients, and whether you are, and if you are a a heritage claimant, do you make the argument? Do you understand these arguments? And are you able to make these arguments? Because that, if you, as a heritage claimant, you are not able to make the arguments in these terms, you are likely to fail. You're likely to do the heritage a disservice. Now, underpinning all of what I've been saying, of course, is how important is heritage? How important is heritage management in the management of our inner cities? How important, and what are the values, our hidden, implicit values about heritage and about the city, and let's say all of those other things that inner cities have, like hospitals and social housing and bus stations and whatever else you want to introduce into that what goes on in an inner city. And what are those how do we weigh, unconsciously, implicitly, let alone and in order to get to being able to do this explicitly, we have to uncover the values we hold for the heritage resources that we are pointing to. And of course, there are all sorts of social significances that may pertain to, as a consequence of the history of that place. Forced removals obviously adds enormous significance for people who do not live there anymore. And how do we explore that, and how do we weigh it up? The presence of religious buildings, the chiming of a church bell at an inconvenient time of night, or the call to prayer from a mosque that happens several times in a day. How do we weigh up these significances, and how do we make an argument about their management, or about their impacts on the significance, and therefore on the environs, and therefore on development proposals? Now, I've been writing about heritage and making arguments about it for quite a long time now. First publication was a book on the Burqa, the Muslim quarter of the inner city of Cape Town, dating back to 1977. So it's sort of that's nearly 50 years, 40 odd years. And since the 70s and 80s and 90s, I've written a lot, and lots of other people have written a lot. I've recently been looking at, partly in order to inform myself about something that's increasingly been bothering me, in that the underpinning values that we have about the city are at odds with actually how important the inner city is, excluding heritage. How important they are, how important the inner city is, how important, and not only the inner city, other parts, the rural environment. But how do we weigh it up against other significances about the environment? Oh, now I'm coming, I've got another few minutes. Initially, I think in the 80s and 90s, and certainly before that in the 70s and 60s, the writings about conservation, it used to be called conservation and heritage, was a word seldom heard back in those days. And we talked about architectural conservation or urban conservation, built environment conservation. A lot of the argument was about authenticity, because in South Africa, certainly until perhaps even the 80s or 90s, the arguments were actually restoration, stripping back, stripping a building of perhaps of everything, in order to return to a golden age, a particular best period of that site or of that place or of that building, was the appropriate way of doing things. As late as, I think, 1985 or 6, the Simon van der Sel Foundation definitely was saying, actually, restoration to a best period that's what conservation management should be aiming at in all cases. So I think quite a lot of writing was arguing about this, essentially about the arguments about authenticity. And gradually the arguments about environments, urban environments, townscapes, rural environments of a wider landscapes, started to be recognizing that how important that was, and the arguments about respecting, finding, identifying heritage or significance, and respecting it, and using it, adapting it, perhaps adopting it, adapting it where necessary, and using it and giving it new life and new meaning was part of the argument. And in most cases, it really meant quite a lot of those kind of arguments were about scale and fitting in keeping is the phrase that's well used in England, in Britain. And those ideas are still the ideas. They seem to still be the ideas that we hold to. Those ideas were developed probably in most sharply and most clearly in Britain and France and Italy, which have very, very different, each of them have quite different legal circumstances, which have led to thinking about in those countries and making arguments about conservation, architectural, urban, heritage management, whatever you call it, however you see it, in different ways, but in very, very different legal circumstances, but certainly in response to what happened in the Second World War, and of course to the urbanization that followed after the Second World War. Now, I think that in South Africa, the dawning of true democracy in the early 90s, in particular from 1994, and the Constitution from 1997, has led to perhaps, I think it's even an analogous situation where we have urbanization taking place of rather different sort, but an increasing urbanization in all the cities of South Africa and the inner city suburbs, inner city environs. Also, investment has changed radically. I think in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, the investment environment in the built environment was slow. From the mid-90s, that has changed. We're now caught up in the cycles, economic cycles that are closer. They're managed globally rather than locally. Though, of course, locally does matter. So I think, but we have not responded to that. We have not adopted our ideas about the environment, the inner city townscapes, what is special about them, and we have not recognized the economic dynamics, the economic impulses, and perhaps most importantly, since 1994, is the absolute necessity for the transformation of our cities, transformation in assisting the making of giving more access to people who were removed or who come to the city, and it is not only race, it is also economic class, economic grouping that we are not thinking about. We're not recognizing the importance of how that should be affecting our values, our values about the implicit hidden values hidden under our skin or inside our heads when we assist in the management of in our inner city environs. So I think that I think that we're essentially I'm saying that this my argument is that we're not doing the simple the straightforward stuff, the applications. We're not doing that well, but more importantly, because what's underpinning that are a set of values which we are not exposing and we are not critiquing. We are not doing even that very well, even when we do try to do that very carefully. And there are cases where we do, of course. I know that, of course. We all have good clients, good cases, good situations where we have been able to make a good argument, and the authorities have had a good substantial reason for making a decision, and they've made decisions with being able to articulate good reasons for doing that. There are cases, but very few, and but we are still. I think we are not working hard enough. I think with that, I think I can stop. Elwyn said, "Don't make comments, only ask questions." If you can make a quick comment, I think comments are as good as questions. I will certainly regard comments as questions, but without interfering with Elwyn's managing of this, perhaps just try and phrase your comment as a question. Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Stephen, for that. Yeah, yes, I just didn't want another presentation. That's all. But thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you for giving us that insight and providing your thoughts on the values and issues of heritage conservation in the growth and development of cities. I personally found it extremely interesting. Now, there is basically 5 minutes that we've going to allow for questions. What I'd like you to do is anybody who would like to pose a question, to raise your hand, and if I see a hand, then I can call upon you to field the question. Anybody would like to ask a question at this stage?
Okay, if not a question, then let's have an argument. You can't all agree with me.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. Well, perhaps you did such a good job that you covered everything.
No, I'm sure not. I'm sure not.
Is anybody then for questions or a short comment? How's that?
Is everybody falling asleep? Come on, you guys. There must be somebody there who is.
No, I think your presentation was so well tailored that it covered everything. Okay. All right. Well, then I think. But anyway, thank you, Stephen, for that. And I'm sure it certainly gave a good start to our symposium by opening our minds.
Let me challenge everybody a little more then. Can I say all of these people listed here, can I say you all agree with me?
Yeah.
And cite you all by name.
That may open something now. Okay, I've scrolled down the list of
nobody. Okay, I'll have to take the whole list.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've scroll down the list of participants,
Okay.
there doesn't seem to be anybody wanting to question or with a short comment. Well, I think we've let you off lightly, Stephen.
Okay.
How's that?
Okay.
Okay, thank you so
Right.
much for that, Stephen. Thank you. We can now get on to our next presentation of paper, which is Helene Potgieter. Helene Potgieter, I just want to introduce her. She founded HPA in 2002, which produces original, functional, and sustainable designs that encompass building conservation and adaptive reuses, heritage building information modeling, as well as skills transfer and development. And examples of her work in the field of building conservation and adaptive reuse is the Parliament Precinct Security Upgrade in Cape Town, Dipker Community Learning Centre, JDA City and Suburban Affordable Rental Accommodation, and the Pretoria City Hall Restoration. So Helene's title is, as you can see, Heritage Issues, Opportunities in Pretoria's Changing Inner City Environment. She will look at 3 case studies in the Pretoria inner city and to illustrate why building conservation and circular economics make good financial sense. Well, Helene, that sounds extremely interesting and we look forward to your presentation. So please, will you proceed? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. So I am based in Pretoria, and when we actually received the invitation to submit a proposal for a presentation, I actually changed the issues to opportunities, and I would like to discuss 3 case studies in the inner city of Pretoria. And we all know that historically where we are in terms of urban design, the inner cities of our sort of metropolis are all actually facing huge challenges at the moment. So I'm going to start off by the question, why building conservation? And I would like to cite just a piece of statistics here. Demolition waste in the USA, and that is only demolition waste that is generated from the construction industry, now it resulted in up to now in 7,200,000 square kilometers of habitat loss due to landfalls. And we can actually, that gives us an area equal to the island of Cyprus, or an area that matches 40% of the size of the Kruger National Park. Then the next question here is, why then transforming to circular construction? And I think we all agree that there is a huge opportunity to actually redefine building waste from being valueless to being an untapped potential for building materials, for example, crusher run, etc. So then the image that you see there is similar to the image that was taken on the Earthrise image that was taken aboard the Apollo 8 spacecraft on the 24th of December 68. And that was actually the first image where we as human beings could actually look at our very beautiful, very vulnerable Mother Earth, sort of against the backdrop of space. And this image, as we all know, actually resulted in quite a mind shift in terms of, firstly, how beautiful, and secondly, how vulnerable our planet is. She is our finite resource. We all come from her and we will all go back to her. So, sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction. Next slide. So the 3 case studies that I will be focusing on here, what you see here is an image of the inner city of Pretoria. At the top here is the Union buildings. On the sort of the right-hand side here, which is to the
Sorry,
east.
sorry, may I
Yes.
just interrupt? I think there's a little bit of problem with your slides, Celine. They're not,
Okay.
yeah, they're not appearing. Yeah, there we go. It's
Okay.
the, yeah,
So,
yeah.
so
Okay.
are we
Thank you.
sorted? Thank you. Thanks for
Yeah.
that. So,
No, sorry, the slide is a 3 case history.
yes,
Yeah,
3 case studies. And
Yeah.
then that's with the sort of an aerial view of the inner city of Pretoria. So at the top there, i.e. to the north, we've got the Union buildings. Just for orientation, to the east, we've got Loftus Versveld. And just to the east of that is the Vergeet My Nie female res, which is one of my case studies that I will talk about. Then in the middle here, we have the Madeleine Hotel, which is on the corner of Hamilton and Pretoria's. And that building actually has got it's got $1 million view onto the Union buildings. And then to the left, i.e. to the west here, is the Park Lodge Hotel, which actually faces onto the Burgers Park, which is actually the oldest park in Pretoria. So next slide. So first case study, Madeleine Hotel. This building is approximately 110 years old. It is within Sunnyside.
Sorry, may I interrupt
Yes.
again? It's not, yeah, moving on.
Okay, let's just see what we can do here.
You may have to close and then reboot. I don't know. I'm not too sure.
Okay. Let's just give us a minute here. We're going to stop sharing.
It was fine.
Okay, was it fine?
I
Okay.
think
Yes, it was fine.
Alwyn,
Okay.
I think it's your internet connection.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay, so then are we all on the Madeleine Hotel at slide number 4? Can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so
Yeah,
this
I can see.
building, thank you, 110 years old within the area of Sunnyside, which is just on the cusp actually of the inner city of Pretoria. When I became involved here, I was presented by the client, the owner of the building, with a demolition. The client was in possession of a demolition permit for this building. And the building at that stage was mothballed for about 5 years. What we then did was we actually presented the client with a business model where we illustrated that to restore and refurbish the building instead of going for a demolition and a new build would actually result in a 40% reduced cost in terms of the development cost. And I think, as we all know and understand, property owners and property developers, they do talk in terms of financial matters. That is a reality. So what we did here is we actually embarked on a full restoration and demolition of this, not demolition, sorry, a refurbishment of this building. The project took us 18 months. And we were able to, I'm going to show you a few slides. We were really able to restore the building back to a magnificent hotel, wing of the existing hotel. And the interesting thing is that the patrons actually now asked to be housed in this wing. And that is simply due to the ambiance of the historic building. We also actually discovered some handcuffs during the construction period because a part of this building was actually part of the old Sunnyside police station. So we actually resorted to doing a bit of an exhibition as well on the history of that area, the inner city of Pretoria, and also what we found on the site. So I'm going to the next slide, which is slide number 5. And these are really just a few before and after pictures. At the top left-hand corner, you can see a before image of the courtyard. That was when we started with the project. And then on the right-hand side is the fully refurbished courtyard, We actually also went to the extent of cleaning all the entire face brick plinth of the building, and then obviously a full restoration and a repair process followed that. Top left-hand, bottom left-hand corner, also before image, bottom right-hand corner and after image. So I'm going to go to the next slide again, just to show you a few before and after images. Top left-hand corner again before, top right-hand corner after, bottom left-hand corner before. That is actually the entrance now to the new boardroom. And top right-hand corner is then what it looks like today. So I'm moving to the next slide. Again, top left-hand corner is what the boardroom looks like after it's been fully restored and refurbished. And the access door there that you see there is actually the old entrance door into the hotel that we moved into this position. Bottom right-hand corner is just a view of the boardroom. You can see the timber floors also beautifully restored. And then bottom left-hand corner is just a view of what the courtyard looks today. And this is then the wing of the whole sort of hotel complex that patrons actually specifically ask nowadays to be housed in. So next slide, I'll move to slide number 8. This is just again an aerial view of the courtyard. Right-hand side is the other side of the original front door that we moved into the access door for the conference facility. And what you see here in the courtyard is then we actually went to the archives of the city of Tshwane to get some old historic photos, which we then turned into a permanent exhibition. And that is to tell the history of the inner city of Pretoria. On the right-hand side here is just an example of one of the bedrooms, which is what you see today. So I'm going to move over to the next slide. So again, I would just like maybe to recap to say, we call it in our office a happy ending for an old building. And for us, the Model Lane Hotel is one of those happy case studies. The next slide, the next case study that I'm going to touch on is the Park Lodge Hotel, which is opposite the Burgers Park. And Melrose House actually also faces onto the Burgers Park. I think you all would know that the peace of Vereniging at after the Anglo-Boer War was actually signed in Melrose House. And Burgers Park, being the oldest park in Pretoria, is actually also one of the largest parks in Pretoria. The park measures approximately 4 hectares in size and was the go-to place in the Victorian age for people to go and promenade and to actually socially interact. So what happened here was, I'm going to proceed to the next slide. This is a historic timeline that we compiled as part of the heritage application for the Park Lodge Hotel, which is in the bottom right-hand corner, which is my case study. And I'm not going to elaborate on this, but that is really a park with a very rich and a sort of important history as part of the history of the inner city of Pretoria. So I'm going over to the next slide. So this is the hotel, and when we started there, I think it was about 10 years ago, this is what we found, this is what we encountered, was a building without a roof, and that was really in a state of very serious disrepair. This is basically what the facade looks like today. That is the facade that faces onto the Burgers Park. So I'm quickly going to just take you through a few before and after photos. Top left-hand corner, we did a complete refurbishment of the kitchen. We actually found that the equipment in the kitchen is still actually very sound. So we did a full cleanup of all the kitchen equipment. We retained the old sort of NCI floor tiles. We all know that they last forever. So this is again before and after. A fully functional kitchen today with a very happy chef, with a chef's kitchen and all the cold rooms, freezer rooms that is required. At the bottom left-hand corner here, again, before, this is what we encountered. And what we have today is a serving area. These windows actually look out onto the Burgers Park. And this is the serving area that leads from the kitchen. So next slide, again, the lounge area, just to show you before and what we have today in terms of the lounge. Again here, interesting, the next phase that we actually sort of started with was to form a link between the old historic house, which is the reception area for the Park Lodge Hotel. And this is the old face brick building that I showed you. And this is the link here that we formed between reception and the hotel. We actually, what we call this is we practice some non-architecture here, because this was just literally the idea there was just to form a functional link between the two buildings. Next slide. Again, just to show you what we encountered, that's our link. And then with actually minimal landscaping, we all understand what the importance is of landscaping, just for our well-beings as humans. And this little patio area here that opens out from the dining room is at the moment the most popular place where patrons actually, prefer to sit. This is the link road on the side of the face brick building that takes one from the back, from this side, to the front area that looks onto the Burgers Park. And this is a before and that is an after picture, just to show you what was actually accomplished there. Next slide. Just again, the link road, and these are just some of the covered walkways that we also inserted onto the wing adjacent to the historic building. Next slide. This is actually the current phase that we're working on at the moment, and we are literally handing over this area, this zone, to the client at the moment. So you can see here, this is the link that I showed you previously between the old historic house, that is reception. This is the red face brick building. And what we're doing at the moment, and as I say, we're actually busy opening up and handing over to the client. This is a temporary drywall that we inserted. Here you see the drywall from the other side, and down here I will show you now. We designed and constructed 3 boardrooms for our client. And just as a matter of interest, just to show you some before and after pictures that make us very happy in the office, that DB that you see there is the DB that is positioned here. This door here actually leads onto the swimming pool area that I will show you now. So this DB is that DB is this one here. Next slide. This is actually the 2 of the 3 boardrooms where we inserted the new boardrooms into the ground floor adjacent to the kitchen area. And what you see here on the left-hand side is what it looked like in January 2024, when we did our handover to the contractor. And these are the boardrooms. We're actually here busy with our first site meeting in the new boardroom that was formed in that space. Next slide. You will come to understand how this is the 3rd boardroom that actually folds around the swimming pool area that I will show you now. So this portion is actually new build, and this is the entrance door into the conference number 3. still under construction. And this is what it looked like a week ago when where we are now busy with handover to the client. Next slide. Just to show you some of the newly installed toilets, the newly installed lift lobby. Next slide. Then at the back of the red face brick building, so here we that is the back facade of the building. The front facade faces onto the Burgerspark. And this is again an image at site handover January 2024. And this area was then sort of transformed into a pool and a bar area. That is the big boardroom with windows that the covered walkways to the three boardrooms that face onto the pool area. Next slide. And just to show you again, literally, this is work in progress. The pool, the bar, this is a 3D image of the bar. Just again to show you where we are today. Next slide. So this image was taken a week ago. And as you can see, we're literally here in the final throes. So just to orientate you, what you see here on the right-hand side is the red face brick building. We inserted this covered walkway with a new boardroom on that side. And then with the pool and the bar area, the whole idea being that patrons, conference patrons, as well as hotel patrons can actually come and have tea and coffee here, or obviously use the bar or have a swim. This, again, just to show you, this was literally taken a week ago as part of the project handover. Next slide. An interesting development, and this is now, I think, a very good example of citizen involvement. This is an article that appeared in the Pretoria Record, which is our local newspaper, on the 1st of October, where several interest groups actually took hands and started to clean up the Burgerspark. That is the old bandstand, the old greenhouse, and this is the extent of the waste and the filth that is being removed. I think this is a good reflection of the challenges that our inner city areas are actually experiencing today. And what we are doing at the moment is I had a chat with my client, and what we agreed is that she will actually provide water, drinks, and toilet facilities to these groups of people that are on a pro bono basis busy cleaning up the Burgerspark. I think this is a good example of the starfish principle, where every incremental step actually at the moment ultimately does make a finish. And it's quite interesting how these events just all come together. So as I said, this is literally work sort of in progress at the moment. Then over to the next slide. So what I want to actually sort of point out here is that one should never underestimate the economic potential of any city center. And for me, this obviously with, what I'm presenting here is with reference to the Pretoria City Centre. One should not be deterred by the decay of infrastructure, the filth, and the extent of disrepair that one actually encounters. But every improvement ultimately will positively impact in the direct sort of in the direct environment of any building or any area. Small steps forward. It asks for perseverance. And I can say here that the high occupancy rate of the Park Lodge Hotel rooms actually are testimony to the fact that one should never underestimate the economic potential of the inner city areas. As a matter of interest, the new conference facilities that we are actually still in the process of handing over to the client are now fully booked to the extent where the client had to negotiate with the main building contractor to in terms of the snagging and the de-snagging of those areas. So I think that is a good problem to have. Next slide. So the last case study that I will touch on is the University of Pretoria, the Vergeet My Nie female residence, which is I think now actually 100 years old. On the left here is just an image that was taken in 1926. And in 2019, we were appointed by the University of Pretoria to do a full restoration and repair of the oldest female res. And on the right-hand corner here is just a part of the 3D model that we built. And that's just a rendering of the main facade, which is basically the same as on this side. We retained the old historic corrugated sheeting roof. I think we all know that those sheets are actually almost indestructible. We inserted 2 layers of insulation, which I will show you. And that is obviously for you know, to ensure a cool building in summer and a warm building in winter. And items that were harvested during the construction period are now permanently on exhibition in the House Committee room. So next slide. These are just some examples of the fully restored and refurbished residence, female res. These light fittings here have got an interesting story to tell. I'll get to that now. Then this is now where the interesting part comes in, and that is when we started at the onset of the project, Willem, my colleague, and our structural engineer went and they actually poked their heads. They lifted a ceiling panel here and they poked their heads into the space. You can see, you will recognize that light fitting. And actually to realize that there's a huge space that is now obscured by this suspended ceiling that was installed later. We're not sure when. And our structural engineer actually made the comment and said, but you know, this is a good space that can be utilized. And that got us thinking. So I'll go to the next slide. And what you see here is that red dotted line that you see there is that line of the ceiling that was then taken out. And we again did a financial model where we showed our client, the University of Pretoria, that we could actually insert 14 additional bedrooms in this space over here at 50% of the development cost of new build. And any university residence bedroom, the development cost is equal to the development cost of a 3-star hotel bedroom. So what we did here was we inserted a floor, this is the line of the new composite floor that we inserted at this point. And you will see these old, beautiful Oregon pine portal frames were restored and repaired. I'm going to show you now. Again, this is just the line of the new floor that the composite, we could not come in here with wet works. The historic building fabric was just too fragile. That's why our structural engineer, the floor that we inserted is a combination of a steel subframe with boarding on top and with a surface bed on top of that to make the floor soundproof. And I will show you now where this window is within the new configuration. So that is the window. That if we go back to the previous slide, this is the passage. These are the portal frames that we had to actually raise just over the width of the passage. And then we've got 2 rows of bedrooms leading from the passage. So we'll just go back to the previous slide. Again, just to orientate you, that is the window. So this is actually the line of the passage. And then we've got 2 rows of bedrooms that lead from the central passage. Passage again, next slide. This is to show you what the bedrooms look like. We inserted Velux windows into the roof space. And these are the fully restored and repaired and slightly fortified portal frames, Oregon pine portal frames that we chose to expose, as you can see. Next slide. Just an example of one of the bathrooms within that loft space. Again, you know, we had the approach to obviously show those incredibly beautiful old Oregon pine portal frames. Next slide. I think I just want to stop here by saying that again, the crux of this, the successful installation of the 14 additional bedrooms was that we could prove to our client, which was the University of Pretoria, that 14 new bedrooms could be installed at 50% of the development cost of new build. And I think that is at the moment for us, the good news that we can actually convey to clients, and that is that building conservation makes good economic sense as well. So next slide. I'm quickly going to touch on a very successful skills transfer and development process that we conducted as part of the restoration of the old Army HQ, which is also in Pretoria. And the 20 people from within the Department of Defense were nominated to us. That was as part of the restoration and the repair of the old Army HQ. And we then said to them, our approach was, we will aim to let them understand what it takes to undertake a restoration and repair sort of a project. So at the top here is our land surveyor, Rob Buckley, who's showing one of our students, Miranda, just how a dumpy level work. And what we said to them is, we're not going to teach you to work with a dumpy, but we want to understand you what the capabilities are of a dumpy level. We also did a full 3D scanning of all the buildings. And here we just sort of our 3D scanning contractor is just explaining to the team what that entails. Our health and safety officer took them through the health and safety file. Then this was the practical completion handover process. We, as a matter of policy, try to implement a skills transfer and development project with every single project that we do. And we also have the sort of approach that even with a construction mafia, we try and work with them, because we have had extremely successful stories where people started as cleaners and they were upskilled to store managers. And actually at the end of our projects, they were able to find jobs on other construction sites. So I think this is also a process that should not be underestimated in terms of adding value. Next slide. So in my office, we follow the whole sort of concept of the narrative as part of building conservation with great interest, because as we know, every old building has got a story to tell. This is, again, at the University of Pretoria campus. We moved the Air Force monument into a new position, and that gave us the opportunity to have a replica made of the eagle, which is the SA Air Force symbol. And we had the opportunity to tell the story about the first Trans-Africa flight, which actually landed on the experimental farm at the University of Pretoria. And the person who was actually successful, the pilot, was a gentleman by the name of Van Reineveld. There is a suburb in Pretoria that is named after him. And he was, after this successful venture, which ended in Cape Town, He was then mandated by Jan Smuts, who was the then Prime Minister, to set up the South African Air Force. So I think we all, as part of this grouping, understand what a blue plaque means. A blue plaque has got no legal bearing, but it is just a blue plaque is there to tell you, maybe if you're interested, stop and read what is on the plaque, because there is something interesting to tell. I think we all know that the tradition of the blue plaque originated in England as part of English heritage, which is our which is the department, which is the section of our equivalent of the Department of Public Works that is responsible for the heritage fabric in England. So next slide. Again, just a few interesting case studies that I saw all over the world on how stories are being told. On the left hand here, and this I did not see personally, but this is an example in Austria, where if one stands in a specific position, then the diagram actually completes the outline of what the original building looked like. I thought that was quite a nice way of, an interesting interactive way of, completing a picture. On the right-hand side here is a very interesting example that I saw in Orchard Road in Singapore, where if you stand here and you read what is here on that little plaque, it tells you that if you stood in this position 100 years ago and you looked in that direction, this is what it looked like, which is that silkscreen image on the sheet of glass. Next slide. This is an interesting example that I came upon in Chelsea in London. I was actually on my way to the Army Museum, where an ordnance survey map was inserted into a walkway, and that's actually a fountain that was not working at the moment when I took the photo. But this area is always full of mothers, children, kids that are playing in the water. And I think quite an effective way also to show what the road looked like, what Fulham Road looked like at the time of King Charles II. Next slide. This is there is a Dutch artist duo by the name of Studio Drift. And they are not architectural historians. It's actually quite interesting because sometimes what they do is not historically correct, but I think that is part of that makes for an interesting discourse. And what you see here is where they actually, by means of static drone lighting technology, they complete just the picture of old historic buildings. On the left, we've got the Colosseum. On the right, we've got the Sagrada Familia, which, as we all, I think the completion date for this project is in 2026. So it's actually worth following them and finding them, because they do extremely interesting work, which I think is quite relevant. So next slide. Again, just closer to home, this is the Irene dairy farm, which is still a fully operational farm. I live adjacent to Irene, and this is the old milk wagon that used to deliver milk. This is an old cocoa pan that carted lime for lime slaking between a quarry and where the lime slaking happened. And this is the old diesel pump that actually watered the fodder or the lucerne fields for the dairy farm. As a matter of interest, I actually live on the estate where this where the fodder was actually cultivated for the dairy farm. So next slide. I think this is also a trend or that is actually worth mentioning. We follow them, and we're actually now part of the work group, Hello Lamppost, which also originated in the UK. This whole grouping, this was started in 2018, and they use technology to make cities more people-friendly, and they encourage interactive participation between people and the built environment. And this whole trend is also referred to as urban gamification, which is also actually worth maybe if you're interested to go and have a look at that. And so next slide is just to show you how Hello Lamppost works. It's literally a poster on a lamppost with a QR code. And when you actually click on that, it tells you the story of where you are, of the environment, of where you are at that time. Next slide, just to show you just a sort of a chat unfolding on Hello Lamppost. Next slide. So as I've said, I think the benefit or the interesting thing for us about Hello Lamppost is how that sort of stimulates citizen involvement by means of an interactive process where literally all that you need is a cell phone. Now, I'm actually now at the conclusion of my presentation, and I would like to mention the 2021 Pritzker Prize architects by the name of Anne Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Vassal, where they now say that for them, demolition is a design mistake. I think it's an interesting view, and I think it's a view that we should actually take note of. And that encourages just the principle to look at different eyes, to look with different eyes, even at building rubble. Then we work with incredible young professionals in South Africa in the environment of construction. And that ranges from Diepkloof to the Joburg inner city, the city and suburban area, Alexandra, Lombardy West, and more. And what happened, I just want to cite you a very interesting thing that happened at the Diepkloof site. It is a site that is earmarked for a tertiary educational college. And we were just appointed to deal with the heritage application. And by the time that we got involved, the design was approved and the entire building on the site was actually earmarked for demolition. At that point, I realized that it was too late to start trying sort of, redirect the course here. But what I did ask the project manager is just to give me an opportunity to talk to the professional team and to give them some information on why we should be very careful or consider very carefully if we want to demolish and start with new build. And I showed them some great examples of where derelict buildings that were global examples of where derelict buildings that were due to be demolished were actually reworked into incredible housing projects and more. And I am delighted to say that the discussion with this young professional team was so well received. And I think that is where I see my function at the moment, is to hopefully gently and not in a top-down way, is just to make people aware of the fact that our planet is a finite resource, and that by means of life cycle thinking, we can actually, have different outcomes. This is a project that Anne Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Vassal did in the inner city of Paris, where they were appointed by the city of Paris to refurbish a housing project. Now, we know that in the inner city areas of the metropolitan cities, it is the poor that live in housing estates. But what they did was they actually went and they had an interview with every single person who lived in this building. And they came away with a conclusion, although as architects, they might think that it's an ugly building, but the bottom line is that the people who live here are attached to the building because that is what they know. And they went through a process of a total refurbishment of the building, where they carefully listened to what the wishes and the needs were of the occupants. They fitted out the roof areas with incredibly wonderful roof gardens, safe spaces for children, and more. And I think that this transformation of the housing block for me is one of the best examples for me personally of what can actually be achieved. So next slide. So I would just like to conclude with this statement by Masanobu Fukuoka, which was a Japanese farmer and philosopher. He has passed away. He's not with us anymore. But he said that if we throw Mother Nature out of the window, she will come back through the front door with a pitchfork. Okay, so that's it. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Aline, on that somber note. Thank you so much for your interesting slides and your thoughts on your conservation work, and also, again, opening our minds to the opportunities afforded by repurposing historic buildings. And, I just want to leave on that sort of tone, I'd like to just share a thought by the author Lewenthal, who writes, on heritage matters, and he says, heritage is not history at all. It's not an inquiry into the past, but a celebration of it, a profession of faith in the past tailored to present day purposes. So with that, it's time for questioning. I see, I think before we do take questions, there's been quite a bit of chatting in the chat box. If I may just go back to a question, Jonathan Stone, why is grey used for the external walls and doors and windows? That is relating to your Madeleine Hotel. Would you like to, Helene, just comment on that?
Yes, can you just repeat the question, please?
The question is, why is grey used for the external walls and doors and windows?
So I'll go back to the slide. That was what was researched under the layers of paint. And, we went through a process of consultation with the client as well. And so we found sort of a happy medium between what we found historically and what the client actually also felt that would work for her.
Thank you. That seems fair. And then there was just a comment from Bruce Aitson. Please fix that lost little house opposite the zoo. I don't know where that is. That in Burger Park or where?
No, I think you might be referring to the old cultural history museum where the mummy used to be.
Bruce, can you just
Bruce?
come in on this?
Right.
Okay.
Hi, sorry, I enjoyed your presentation because I'm an old Tukkies and I was there in February.
Thank you.
And I loved what you did with Madeleine Hotel and little bits on landscape. And thank you. Now that you're looking at the comments, Elwyn, please, because I only just figured out how to do the hand thing. I can never remember.
No.
Yeah, no, it was very inspirational. Having had Le Corbusier shoved down my throat in omgewingsgeskiedenis at Tux all those years ago, I'm very glad to see some of those buildings going and all of those other things that we were told are so fantastic. Keep up the good work. I like the old stuff.
Yeah, where is that building that you're referring to, Bruce?
No, it's just all these visions of modernism that surround us.
Oh, okay.
And many of the things that are built in Cape Town today, which have zero heritage value, but somehow seem to get approved by heritage authorities, I do not understand it.
Yeah, okay, no, fair enough. Yeah, okay, sure. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bruce.
Any other questions?
Kirk White has a question.
Yes, Kirk. Would you go ahead, please?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I
Yes.
can.
Yes, okay. Sorry, could I go back? Apologies to Helene, to Stephen and ask him a question.
Of course you
no,
can. You're welcome.
Certainly.
Okay. Stephen, well, I'm taken a while sort of recovering from the assault that you made on how poorly we argue our cases. Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I'm wondering, you said one of the things we do very badly are to highlight or emphasize the values which we are projecting. I'm a little bit unsure of that, of what you are referring to when you talk to values, because that could very easily become a very wide thing when you of self criticality. Are you restricting values to simply the Heritage Resources Act? I'm not too clear on what you meant by that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Would you mind sort of coming in on that?
Sure. The point that I was making is that the implicit values, the bigger frame, how does heritage fit into the frame that we have for the inner city, given today's symposium and what we're talking about? Though I don't limit it to that. It's how do we weigh up heritage values, the significances that we may research, and we may very carefully go through and make very careful arguments. How do we weigh those up against other sets of values, the other things that we have to do, what the Constitution requires us to take into account? And in this sense, I suppose I didn't say so, but I think that in South Africa we're extraordinarily lucky, because the Constitution requires that we make arguments that in other countries practitioners and architects can get away without arguing. We have to argue these things and weigh them up against other sets of values. So the point, the simplest illustration, the way in which to illustrate it is to say, well, how do you say to a local authority that wants to build social housing, no, you can't build social housing because this is a degraded inner city area, and we think that the 3-story buildings won't fit into that, even though there are only single stories there, or because there are only single stories there, and there's a community that says that they would like to keep it single stories, because that's regarded as this is what there's the consistent environment, the physical environment, but because there is a resistance, no, you shouldn't build it. And I'm saying, well, actually, there are hard choices always to be made, and they can only be made with an explicit recognition of other sets of values. Am I helping there, Kirk? No, thank you. Thanks. It helps a bit. Yes. Mm-hmm. Often the heritage arguments are the weaker ones. I think that's what you were saying. Hmm? No, I'm not. I'm just saying I'm saying they must be weighed. I'm saying okay. I'm not arguing that. I'm saying that our job as if we're interested in the not only, I'm saying we mustn't be interested only in heritage. we must recognize that it fits into into a bit bigger frame of values.
Yeah,
And
thank
we
you.
need to
So-
think that what are the effects of that?
So I would just like to, from my point of view and from my experience, is that all the case studies that I've actually shown here actually made good economic sense.
Yes.
So that's my contribution. Not that it's not the only solution, but in the field that I work and where I was successful in concluding projects like, similar to the ones that I've presented here, all of these projects actually made good economic sense.
Thank you, Aline. Thank you, Stephen, for also that reply. Thank you. I think we must now proceed to the third presentation, which is the presentation by Agnes Shiningamwi. Is that the correct pronunciation? Agnes is a heritage professional with experience in the management of heritage sites. She has served as the site manager on the Twelfontein World Heritage Site. She currently holds the position of Regional Heritage Officer of the National Heritage Council of Namibia. She has a master's degree in education, postgraduate degree, diploma in heritage conservation and management, and a Bachelor of Education honours, all from the University of Namibia. Her current work is she's pursuing a PhD in ecotourism and protected areas management at the International University of Management. So the title for her presentation is Decolonizing Heritage Management Systems, New Directions in Digital Heritage Management from Namibia. And she says she says that the argument will include the sentiments for the adoption of a broader decolonized approach to heritage management, one that will better represent Namibia's post-colonial identity, and that which promotes a more equitable recognition of its heritage. So with that, Agnes, I'd like to ask you to proceed with your paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much again once for the opportunity granted to me. Good afternoon, everybody. As introduced, my name is Agnes Shiningamwe, and I'm from Namibia. The presentation that I'm about to make is part of the paper that was recently published, and it was on decolonizing heritage management systems in Namibia. Just for orientation purpose, Namibia is just located in southwestern part of Africa. And of course, again, just to give you a bit of background as to where we're coming from, Namibia was a German colony already in 1884, and following the Second World War, it was then handed over to South Africa as a mandate under the League of Nations. Even though the aim was to prepare for Namibia for independence, South Africa instead annexed it, and then obviously resulting in imposing some of the laws that were in South Africa over to Namibia. The country then obtained its independence in 1990, and also then marking a shift in how heritage is viewed and preserved. Again, just for the sake of orientation, Namibia is very rich in natural and cultural heritage resources, with about 141 sites currently on the National Heritage Register. And only 34 sites were entered onto the National Heritage Register after independence. But then again, I will explain as to later in my presentation, why am I saying rich, yet only 34 sites exactly were entered onto the National Heritage Register following the country's independence. And 3 of the 14 regions remain unrepresented on the National Heritage Register. And some of the heritage resources, especially that of that speaks to archaeological, paleontological, meteorites, and also building in conservation areas, enjoys blanket protection in terms of the Act, meaning that whether they are declared or not, entered onto the National Heritage Register or not, they enjoy the blanket protection in terms of the Heritage Act, and that is the National Heritage Act number 24 of 2007. Now, in terms of the colonial legacy in heritage management of the country, even though no heritage regulations were implemented during the German colonial period, South Africa extended its own heritage laws, such as the Natural and Historical Monument Relics Antiquity Act of 1934, and also later on the National Monument Act of 1969. So the National Heritage Act 2004 became the very first formal law in Namibia. And that means that the 1969 National Monument was still in implementation up until the year 2003. So obviously, given the our political history as a country, after gaining independence, obviously Namibia inherited numerous colonial monuments that were established across its landscape during the German and South African colonial periods between 1884 and 1989. And since Namibia independence, then really a whole lot of debates came up as to whether the country should move, whether they should remove, or whether they should keep some of these colonial monuments. And I'm also going to give several examples. So this led to a shift in symbolic meanings, identities, and memories represented by these monuments as they were increasingly replaced with a new layer of post-colonial narratives. One of such monuments is the famous Rider Monument, the Rieder Denkmal, which is also referred to some author or writers as the Equestrian Monument. And it is actually amongst the oldest statues in Namibia. The statue was inaugurated in 1912 and with the purpose to honor the German soldiers and German civilians in the celebration of overcoming the Ovaherero and Nama uprising, which took place from 1904 to 1908. And also this then also became recognized as the first genocide of the 20th century. So the monument was inaugurated in 1912 and then proclaimed as the national monument in 1969. But then again, as I said, following Namibians' independence, this was actually one of the most controversial colonial monuments. And it resulted in its removal from its original place, which is in front of the Alta Feste, also one of the historical building, which was used as a mission station by the Germans in 2013. And then moreover, the statue was also deregistered as a national monument. The current National Heritage Act actually make provision under Section 40 for the deregistration of places and objects of heritage significance. Of course, just to touch a little bit more on this monument, for some actually they rejoiced over its removal and its deregistration. But then for some, it was also an issue of disappointment, more because of the belief that, of course, This statue also represented or was a tangible element in terms of representing a certain chapter in the Namibian history. And of course, to some, they rejoiced over its removal because to them, they regarded it as a painful reminder of what has happened in the past, more especially because it was associated with the genocide of the 1904 to the 1908. Part of also what I termed as redefining heritage in post-colonial Namibia is that their statue, which is actually the writer monument, was then replaced by two statues. The one on the left being the statue of the founding president of the Republic of Namibia, holding a constitution in his hand, and also representing a modern face of the national liberation struggle. Whereas the statue on the right represent actually the Ovahero and Nama Memorial Genocide statue, and with a man and a woman in a broken chain, signifying their freedom from colonialism. And then also the aim of the statue was to really erected with the purpose of paying tribute to the people who fought and died during the genocide of the 1904 to the 1907. So as we proceed with the decolonization process, it is also very important to indicate that the erasure of colonial memory is also evident not only in the erection and removal of colonial monuments, but also is very evident in the renaming of street. Just to illustrate to you with few examples from some local newspaper, street renaming where obviously some of the streets were renamed with names of individuals that are believed to have played a very pivotal role in the independence of Namibia. And it's also not just limited to street renaming, it also extended further to the renaming of the airports, the places, including towns. And also of recent, I think in November 2022, Namibia also witnessed the removal of the confront statue, which was erected in 1965 outside the Windhoek, which is our capital city municipality's headquarters. Confront was actually recognized as a German officer and an administrator who has also been celebrated, which some actually termed as wrongly celebrated as the founder of Windhoek. So following activist, petitioning and so forth, the statue was then removed in November 2022, making it actually the latest removal of a statue of its nature. In addition to, as I said, the partial erasure of colonial memory, it was also marked with the erection of new sites that would commemorate and celebrate again the individuals that have really sacrificed their lives for the country's independence. On my far right is then the Heroes Acre, which is also built just outside Windhoek. It is a liberation heritage site where the heroes and heroines are laid to rest. And then again, on the bottom left corner, it was also the construction of the Independence Memorial Museum, which was actually again built with the purpose of really illustrating the route to of the liberation heritage struggle up until the country's independence. So that is just to mention a few, even though there is really quite a lot that have taken place in terms of really ensuring that new places that actually celebrate the type of really modern, not really modern, but then a different type of heritage were constructed. But then even though some, again, obviously, because it's always mixed feelings when it comes to monuments, whether it's colonial monuments or post-colonial monuments. So even those monuments that were built after independence, they were not actually, they were not spared from criticism, because some of them were termed as problematic and very controversial, to the extent that some were actually also being termed as the waste of, government or public funds, and more especially because they tend to be exclusive and politically motivated. And then also highlighting that given this really nature of the type of monuments that continue to be even erected after post-colonial era still faces a challenge, there is a need for a balanced representation that reflect the voices of all Namibians. Now, why are we focusing on decolonizing heritage management system? At this point in time, I feel that the focus is actually informed by the following, and that number one is that colonial heritage concept remain dominant in the current heritage legislation. And a very good example is that at the moment, the main legislation, which is the National Heritage Act 27 of 2004, does not really cover a broader aspect or concept of heritage, which celebrate the heritage of, that is very meaningful and very valuable to all Namibians. And I say that coming from an African perspective, especially more speaking on behalf of the many indigenous people in Namibia, where most of our heritage is related to intangible cultural heritage. But despite that, the current heritage legislation actually does not make provision for the recognition of intangible cultural heritage. Of course, there are talks of the review of the act, but that is actually the biggest challenge at the moment. Of course, Namibia has ratified the Convention for Intangible Cultural Heritage, but it is also very imperative that the issues related to intangible cultural heritage are actually weaved in to our local legislation, so that we can also encourage the nomination and also then the representation of that kind of heritage on the National Heritage Register. And also at the moment, if one carefully look at, and I think I have made a particular emphasis giving the statistics in the article that informed this presentation, is that there is an imbalance on the National Heritage Register. And this again is influenced by what is defined as heritage. And at the moment, really, 32% of the places that are on the National Heritage Register speaks to buildings, and these are buildings that were constructed again during the colonial period, 1884 to 1989. And with really indigenous, with only places that speak to indigenous kind of heritage, really only representing about 11% of the National Heritage Register. So really, in brief, is to say that there is a lack of system to capture a broader decolonized concept of heritage in the country. Now, there is a lot of, obviously, definition as to what is decolonization, and also decolonization being such a hot topic and very prominent. It is defined in different ways, of course, but in the context of my research and my study, I define decolonization as to referring to confronting the past and the present biases within the heritage system in Namibia. And by doing that, it also involves integrating indigenous knowledge, practices, and concept of heritage conservation and management. And also really at the bottom of that is the engagement of multiple voices is central to this process. And then again, I would just like to emphasize that to me personally, and also in my work of research, decolonization does not mean that not using colonial system or those of former colonizers should not be used, or that colonial monuments should totally be erased. No, but it should rather be a process that should seek to add new narratives to the existing accounts of the country's heritage. And that is really the basis of what what my advocacy is all about. Presenting some decolonization efforts that happened, that have taken place in Namibia to date is that there was a heritage hunt project that already started in 2015. And the project was really with the support and collaboration of different heritage institutions in the country, where they went around the entire country from region to region, trying to identify places of heritage significance in this in the different regions, and to create a database with the possibility of some of these places to be obviously nominated and then declared as places and objects of heritage significance. I've already actually highlighted and touched on issues of contested monuments, of course, which I continue to say that they continue to be, especially colonial monuments in Namibia, continue to be contested and renegotiated. And of course, as I said, discussions still flare up from time to time, whether they should be kept, removed, or actually kept because they are part and parcel of our heritage. And then I've also briefly touched about the erection of new monuments, new statues and memorials across Namibia, the renaming of whether it's streets, places, and also other places of heritage significance. And then also, most importantly, what we have been working on now is the Digital Heritage Management System, NHRA, very similar to that of South African SARS, and it was also introduced in 2015, and about 2 or 3 years ago, we worked again on the redevelopment of this digital heritage management system, because there were a few challenges that we actually recognized with the initial system. But then it is really just to say that recognizing the role of digital technology all over the world and the prominence that it has gained in the field of heritage management, it is imperative, or it was rather imperative for us that digital technology be deployed as a tool to decolonize heritage management by providing access to all. And in this, I actually meant that there's so many people out there in the country, of course, also being very cognizant of our challenges in the realm of information and technology, but we're just saying that digital technology can actually be another avenue, because when you have your database, your heritage process, whether it's in forms of submitting nomination dossier and so forth, accessible, it can also to a certain extent democratize access to heritage, because then you also provide an opportunity for people all over the country to engage on issues related to heritage management, and also to ensure not only a balanced representation, and that thing that is really some of the keywords that I'm using to say, it is not only to ensure a balanced representation, but to ensure that the heritage remain meaningful and valuable to all Namibians. With that, I just want to conclude that what needs to change in our context is really in terms of our legislation. We need an urgent review of our legislation that capture a broad decolonized concept of heritage, because I said most probably the reason why we also have that few representation of indigenous places on the National Heritage Register is basically also partly informed by what is defined as heritage. And at the moment, the legislation is actually a bit biased towards more built heritage, towards more archaeological, physical, and other places of natural heritage. So we need a legislation that capture a broader decolonized concept of heritage. And also by that, it will need obviously a lot of advocacy in terms of ensuring that indigenous voices are empowered to ensure heritage preservation that reflect all Namibians. And with that, obviously, of utmost importance is the active community engagement in the identification, protection, and protecting of the diverse heritage resources. With that, I thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Agnes, for that. So, of then confronting the subject of decolonizing heritage, and then also sharing your thoughts on heritage conservation, particularly in Namibia. Here again, I can open the floor to anybody who would like to ask any questions or any short comments on what we've just seen. Is anybody that would like to take this opportunity? No, I don't see any hands. Here again. Oh, yes. Bruce, is your hand up?
Bruce has some comments in the chat.
Okay.
Yes, my hand is up, but I wrote my comments as before. So may I just, can I just say thank you very much? That was very interesting. I don't know too much about Namibia. I didn't even know it was a South African colony. That was a bit of a shock, but that's how much I know about history. What kind of examples of overlooked heritage do you miss or think should be included?
Sorry, your question is, just repeat that, Bruce.
What examples, just give us a couple examples of overlooked heritage do you miss? You spoke about decolonizing, but what do you want to add?
Okay. Yeah, Agnes, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. It's the kind of heritage that is overlooked at the moment, as I said, it's actually that which at the moment mostly speak about intangible cultural heritage, whether it's the celebration of particular festivals, events, also the heritage that speaks to traditional craftsmanship and all those. At the moment, on the national level, there is actually no places for the recognition of that kind of heritage. And of course, as we are all aware, with the rapid, obviously advanced in globalization and so forth, there is a risk that this could be lost. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that coming from Zimbabwe, I would say one of the big aspects of culture, traditional culture there, is to do with funerals. Obviously, Europeans have their own type of funerals, but actually they're nothing by comparison with the traditional African type of ceremonies, which are much more extensive than a European type funeral. Is that the kind of thing you would be thinking about?
Yes, that is also part of it. Yeah, even though there's really, really more to it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you. We've got, thanks for that response. We've got a question from Stephen. Would you like to go ahead?
Yes, my question is sort of not unrelated to Bruce's, but just put in a sort of perhaps in a little more concrete way, in that you talk about legislation, and the just for example the example that Bruce has just referred to as being funerals being an important part of a culture and being an important heritage practice. One can't imagine how you would regulate that, because that's what law is for. Legislation is always for for the regulation of it. Even the identification has always has some management attached to it. And so the question is, what are there are some countries, and I'm not suggesting a neo-colonial practice for you, but there are some countries where this has been going on for a long time, where intangible heritages are recognized in Japan and Korea, or South Korea anyway, where there's a different history of identifying heritage. But I suppose my question is, what are the practices, the intangible heritage that you refer to? There must be some cases that you are thinking of. Is it song or dance, and how would that be protected through the legislation that you're referring to?
Yeah, as I have mentioned that it's quite, the cultural practices are quite a lot, whether it has to do with dancing, whether it's a practice related to initiation ceremonies, whether it's related to harvesting and so forth. Now, the kind of legislation change that we are trying to seek is the one that recognizes this practice as part of our heritage. And obviously, by recognizing it, there is, and then it's ought to be a particular way of how do you then ensure that this is there is an inventory for that. And then also there are mechanisms in place to ensure the protection of such. Just like the moment where we have, for instance, a legislation that speaks to obviously the recognition of tangible heritage. Yes, such tangible heritage is identified. Once it's identified, it is recognized. It is then, entered onto the National Heritage Register. There are monitoring sort of mechanism in place and a management. In fact, where there is even a provision to say there ought to be a management plan in place. And that is a kind of change that we are seeking to say the legislation should also equally then find space to recognize the other type of heritage by ensuring that it is continued to be, practiced and celebrated. But then also really here it's about recognizing it, identifying it, ensuring that it is passed on from one generation to another.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I see, Bruce, you've still got your hand. Is that an old hand?
Sorry, I did have 3 questions, but I think the problem from I'm still live. The problem that we have here is that most of us are in the built environment professionals. I made my own point about the planted environment. But let's talk about the edible environment. What about traditional foods in Europe, for example? They have got the whole system of managing certain types of food like Parmesan cheese and certain wine areas. So I don't even know how this is handled in South Africa. In South Africa, we have got a lot of like traditional foods for different regions. And I suppose they're controlled, but it's not really part of the built environment, is it? But maybe you're thinking of this as well, Agnes.
Yes, of course, there are different mechanisms, because even here in Namibia, what we, at the moment, as I mentioned, that we have ratified the 1972, I mean, the Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage. We even have some of the items that are actually entered or recognized at the international level. And with that kind of practices, then there are now mechanisms that are put in place to ensure the celebration and also the upkeep of that. And that is actually what is now currently absent in the national legislation. And one of that is actually it's a celebration of a kind of a type of a drink.
Yeah, I totally get it.
Yeah, thank you, Agnes. I think you've responded to that question. Any further questions? I see there are quite a lot of comments in the chat box. Maybe you should have a look at those. Agnes, I just want to say that just mention a couple of the comments. Thank you, Agnes. A very thoughtful presentation with great insight. Thank you. And then the recording of tangible heritage is already assisted by through recording in a visual manner by memorable photography and recording of traditional music available to all in the form of books and digitally. And that is from Denise Boers. Okay, so those were comments. You just want to just make a final comment on those in the chat box. Okay, thank you very much. I think we should now proceed to the next presentation. Thank you, Agnes, for your paper. Number 4 on the program is by Brian Wintermeyer. And Brian has over 20 years of experience in the heritage and architectural sectors. After a stint in working as an executive in corporate architecture for 3 years, he rejoined his original firm, the Workplace Architects. And Brian has a master's degree in architecture, a master's in philosophy on conservation of the built environment. The presentation today will be done by Gil Brewer on behalf of Brian, who's not able to attend this afternoon. And the title of the paper will be History and Heritage in Inner City Townships, the example of Duncan Village, East London. And the abstract makes the point that inner city townships, such as Duncan Village in East London, hold important yet under-recorded heritage tied to the country's urban development. So with that brief introduction, Dina, would you go ahead, please, and do your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate that the association hosts this platform and has given Brian and myself this opportunity to share some work that we is ongoing and that we have been involved in for the last 2 years. I think as a starting point, to link to Agnes's fantastic presentation, and maybe to speak to some of the questions that came after that, to provide a case study and some examples of how we've gone about trying to add weight to the voice and to bring under-recorded stories into the light, to bring the concept of heritage and interpret it not only through the built environment, but through a number of other cultural, social, and economic lenses. So I hope that this does well to build on that wonderful presentation, which I thank you, Agnes. I thank you for that. Let's get to the next slide. My name is Guillaume Brouet. I'm a senior development economist at a firm called Urban Econ Development Economists. So what I would like to bring to the discussion is a socioeconomic perspective, and that is, how do we use or interpret heritage from a socioeconomic perspective to bring a different lens, to cast a different lens onto our South African history and the history of the various different groups in South Africa that have, come together in this melting pot that we call our own. And we are going to be, I will take you through some of the processes that we've undertaken in a project that we are undertaking, that's ourselves at Urban Econ, along with the workplace agency that we've been undertaking in Buffalo City municipality, that is around East London, in the heart of the Eastern Cape, which focuses on heritage and culture in areas which were formerly the Ciskei and have a very tragic and yet resilient history. And in going through this project, 2 years in, we have started to put together that inventory of heritage assets that go beyond only the built environment, but look for touch points in the landscape and in the stories and in the histories and in the music and the food and the different ways in which the heritage plays out in that particular context. And one of our kind of starting points, or one of the phrases that has stuck with me, is that heritage is inherent. And that speaks to the chair's comment right at the beginning of the session, and that it is inherited as well. So they're all those words of the same root, and link us, the past to the present, with a view towards the future. The case study which gives us the tools to unpack the work that we've done is that of Duncan Village in the center of East London. And we will show you how and when that settlement came to be, and how we've gone about recognizing the heritage as we've been contracted to do by the Buffalo City Development Agency. Often the value of heritage is difficult to address according to the National Heritage Resources Act, and while that's not my forte, I think during the course of this project we've gone out of our way to try and recognize value and extract value, and that value is not necessarily only monetary value or economic value, but value to the social environment, and an attempt to restore and heal people. And I think that's heritage. Heritage is the dynamic side of history, and takes a soft approach to a very intangible concept. And while the built environment is those physical spaces where you can actually locate that heritage, where you can tie it down to a particular asset, that the asset itself is just a small window into a much larger understanding, and that understanding is ever growing and requires interaction and humanization of the heritage, and that these assets and these sites are the physical sites of memory, which are one of the concepts which we've applied in this during the course of this project. And I've worked very closely with Brian, and we sit and go deep into the history and the heritage of various 6 or 7 different settlements within the Buffalo City development in the Buffalo City municipality. Duncan Village itself is a place of very, very large significance in as one of the oldest townships, a township which has hosted, and has brought up luminaries in South African jazz and theatre, and in the struggle going back not only in the apartheid struggle, but to the Defiance campaign, 20, 30, 40 years before that. It is an inner city township in today's terms, and is flanked by former colored and Indian designated areas in the planning, and yet also next to some of the most affluent areas in East London. So while initially it was positioned at the fringes of the town and developed as a place for labor to stay in a typical apartheid, spatial planning approach, it now sits in the very heart of East London, and yet appears to have been left behind with awful conditions and a density that is not conducive for upward mobility, and there seems to be not enough space for the recognition of this settlement, which now at the heart of East London is almost something that most people turn a blind eye to. People who have lived in East London all the time, particularly white people like myself, or would never ever go through Duncan Village and have no idea. They don't glance across the highway at what they see as a scar in the landscape, and that is partially true, but for us to approach it in that way undercuts our ability to recognize and try and recognize value and look at socioeconomic spin-offs and the ability of the economy to sustain this. The conversation around private investment into heritage, looks at old colonial buildings often before looking at indigenous heritage and sites of memory in those spaces. Just some key terms that Brian and I've really put at the heart of this, is what exactly is heritage, and it's already been spoken about in this session, but we need to use a narrative to describe and examine and question and analyze past events and investigate these patterns. And it itself is not a thing and does not exist by itself, nor does it imply a movement or a project. Rather, heritage is the process by which people use the past, a discursive construction with material consequences. And so the kind of applications that we have tried to look at is within this project that we've been involved in. We have been tasked with creating culture and heritage tourism routes in these 7 settlements, and to try and identify and propose specific assets and nodes which could be sustained through public or private investment. but more of that later. A part of this project is the design and the writing and the research behind the creation of over 100 tourism boards, interactive tourism boards with themes around heritage, cultural heritage, around that area. And in one of the key kind of starting points with when it comes to Duncan Village, related to the relationship between the old and the new, and it is still very relevant. But when this settlement was built in 1941, there were two distinct groups that distinguished themselves, and those were Amakaba and the Abantu Basikolweni, which essentially was the advent of the urban black identity in townships, which then densified and continue to densify to this day. And the difference between those that accepted westernization and took education and took foreign influences around the media and music, and that as a juxtaposition to those who only saw the urban area as a place to gain resources to send back into the rural areas. And this becomes a clash between people occupying the inner city townships in Buffalo City. And these clashes were then used and exploited by the apartheid government later on. But as time went by, really come to define those spaces. This is an example of one of the boards which starts to address those initial differences in kind of subgroups in Duncan Village. Duncan Village has this is one of the maps from some research done by Etienne Nell. Duncan Village is highlighted in blue, and you can see at the time was on the fringes of East London, but East London has since moved all the way through to Mdantsane, which is about 20 kilometers inland. At the time when it was built, this was a news article that was in a local newsletter. The equivalent in today's money of those £750,000 was R1 billion in today's money that was spent on the building of this township. Of course, they were, so-called in the interests of sanitation and cleanliness and order, and yet fast forward several years, and it becomes a settlement which is a petri dish for those very things, and unserviced entirely by the apartheid government. It was named after General Sir Patrick Duncan, and was really a key township, which Brian and I went to visit and do several town site visits to start to identify the heritage assets, and then to look at how we could embed them into our project. You can see initially these matchbox houses, which didn't have floors and only had corrugated iron, if not wood, walls. And fast forward to today, and it's one of the most densely populated areas in Buffalo City. And you will see the various different kind of into the modern day RDP style houses, and then hostels, which used to be for migrant laborers, and have since been turned into housing. This is an example of that heritage, which is simply not recognized at this moment in time. I think one of the key things that really has stuck with me is something that I think maybe informs my own opinion, which is that the concept of claimants of heritage needs to be needs to be rethought, because as I started out, heritage is inherent and it is inherited, and that what is the role of the professionals such as yourselves or myself when it comes to collecting and collating these stories. For this project, we held multiple community engagement sessions where we used local community liaisons, and ourselves became community liaisons to some degree. And the community engagement is really about humanizing intangible heritage and tangible assets and sites of memory. And this was something which you need to commit more time than you want to bill for in doing this. And you need to sit and listen to the stories that the people have to tell. You know, this is their story. They were living in Duncan Village when the police arrived on Black Sunday and opened fire on which is now referred to as the Duncan Village Massacre. And yet, so many years on, we see that there are a number of sites of memory, some of which are in a very poor way and some of which have been sustained. And the question is, from a socioeconomic perspective, again, how do we use heritage to benefit the socioeconomic environment? We can't look at these sites in isolation. Now, these sessions that we held were where we brought our ideas about what these boards should be about and asked the community to take the pen and tell us that we were wrong and replace those errors or mistakes or gaps with the real information. And that became a very powerful tool to collect information, oral histories, things that had not been recorded previously, and to put these signs up around the sites in safe places so as to memorialize the spaces in the future and in the past. One of the examples is this statue, which was supposed to commemorate the Duncan Village massacre. And initially, this monument was defaced and vandalized, as you can see on the right. It was fenced off, which is often what we think is the solution to protecting an asset, but almost has the opposite effect, in that now it becomes a target and it's isolated, and there's no custodianship or from the community, there's no ownership, and there's definitely no investment. And some of the problems with this was not that they didn't like the memorialization of the terrible events of Black Sunday, but rather that there hadn't been enough consultation, that they hadn't been heard, that nobody was aware that the monument was going up and who it was a monument to. Those are community concerns which need to be very much taken into consideration, and sometimes you have to go back. And I know that the headache that Brian, myself, and Debbie have had to go through in terms of going back for additional community sessions when the right people didn't happen to be in the room, even though it was poor weather that allowed people not to get out of their homes, and that we had to come back and re-engage and update, and really involve the community in a real level. And it's time consuming and it takes a lot of patience, but it really is the only way to ensure real community buy-in and custodianship. The other issue with this statue was that it looks like a Zulu warrior, and this is in the heartland of where the Xhosa people live. And so there are oversights like that can be overcome by engagement. These are the different areas in which this project has taken place. We have a coastal route. There is another tourism route in Duncan Village, Mdansane in Tabozuko, formerly Berlin, Konce, which is formerly King Williamstown, Zwelicha, Bishu, Dimbaza. These areas are some of where the most successful boxing heritage in South Africa takes has its home. Dunsane is referred to as a boxing mecca. We've engaged world champions in this, and they've pointed down the road and say that's where Happy Boy Mlaji used to live. That was the greatest boxer of our generation. Now that is a physical site where we can really tie down a story of struggle that galvanized thousands of people to become boxers, and there have been tens of world champions that have come out of these areas. The BCMDA is looking at tourism infrastructure as a way to use a heritage to sustain heritage, and one of the key things from our perspective is that throwing money after the problem, particularly in the context of Buffalo City, is very difficult given the financial constraints that we live in, and the public sector's lack of capacity in some cases in administration. So what you're seeing here is the number of boards that we will be put up. Some of them are already up on the East London beachfront. I invite you to go and have a look if you are in those areas. This is Duncan Village and our route concept, which identifies these assets and traces a route throughout Duncan Village. Some more examples of the luminaries which make up the heritage of the place and the records, and the heritage lives on in the music of Johnny Diani and the sportsmen such as Magazole Mapimpi and Lucanio who come from Zwelicha and these areas. They come from a long lineage of rugby heritage in that particular case. Where's the site? It's that old stadium where they used to have massive events, and alongside the boxers would bring the community together, where there would really be ownership of heritage. I see my time is coming to a hastily end. Some 4 sites just to highlight from this area. On the top left corner, note that is Welsh High School, and you will see more pictures of that site in a moment. But on the bottom right-hand corner is the grave site. We talked about the funeral after the previous presentation. The grave sites are not just grave sites as a Christianized white society might look at it, but this is where the ancestors are buried. There's a ritual to bring ancestors into urban areas, which is very important. Duncan Village Heritage Museum is a privately owned house which was started by 3 wonderful ladies who have started to collect those stories and celebrate those stories, not for anyone else, but for the people of Duncan Village themselves. And the story of Sister Aiden, who was brutally murdered on Black Sunday, is memorialized at St. Peter Claver Church. Here are some pictures of Duncan Village Heritage Museum, another fantastic place. I encourage you all to go and visit the ladies there and take a look at the heritage. They will take you to where the first Black Miss South Africa was born, right next to one of the greatest boxers the country has ever seen. This is a repeat slide of that initial history, and this site over here is that of a Welsh High School. Now, Welsh High School was the first and only high school in a period in the 1940s and 50s when the Defiance campaign was at its height, and it's since been knocked down and flattened. Now this school, in a place where education is less than desirable, really represented the best and the brightest, from Steve Chwete to Simon Joe, who was a Springbok rugby player, to several ministers who served in the first democratic government. And yet it's such a shame to see this building, and how exactly that has come to pass is something that is really worrying. But these types of sites need to be recognized. Now, what happens on that particular site is an important question. probably the jewel in the crown of Duncan Village. Right on top of the hill is St. Peter Claver Church, and this is a model which needs to be extended towards all these other assets which have fallen into disrepute, and that is civil society, and schools and institutions and churches and organizations and associations to take ownership and custodianship over a particular story, over a particular heritage asset, and to protect that. There is this oasis in the middle of one of the one of the worst townships in the area is an oasis where they have a soup kitchen, and where the grave, there are several memorials shown on screen for Sister Aden, who was a nun who traveled to the Eastern Cape, and who in a fated moment was murdered during the rioting on Black Sunday. Now, her story is something which brought great shame on the community who themselves had committed that crime, and yet there's great pride in the fact that her story will not be forgotten and is memorialized into perpetuity. We need to apply schools to take on a particular a memorial, if not a grave site, and to memorialize that once a year, to come together and recognize the contribution of people, of music, of food, of memory, of sites, of architecture. This is another a site which has recently been upgraded by Buffalo City Municipality, that of W.B. Rubusana, who was a founding father of the ANC, who was the first black man to serve in the Cape Council. Now, none of these stories, I would be surprised if many in attendance, know the stories of these luminaries. This site, if you look at the picture on the bottom, would only likely be maintained because somebody actually lives on site, and protecting that heritage is a very difficult task, which often takes resources which are beyond the financial capabilities of the municipalities. This man, Dr. Rubusana, started the first Xhosa language newspaper. He started a number of the sports clubs in the area, and yet also led the ANC in a very dark time. And these stories really are our heritage and the heritage of the people of Duncan Village. And you only have to go into Duncan Village. I say only, very few of us do. But when you go into Duncan Village and you ask people, those people that do remember, you can hear it, you can see it, that this is living heritage, even though it's long gone in the past. In conclusion, and maybe on a dim note, these 4 photographs were taken 20 years apart. On the top left, you have the launch of the memorial and the grave site of Elcott Gwenche, one of the leaders in the ANC Youth League, who was brutally murdered by the apartheid government. And yet, in the present day, as you can see, the site is completely in a state, and there is raw sewage running across the area, and it really is quite a dangerous, hazardous area. And yet, how are we going to leave it there? Do we do nothing? You can't even access that site at the moment, or is there some kind of recognition? We have to ask ourselves, as people working in heritage, how do we approach this site, and how should we overcome this? And for us, that was one of the major challenges. But I think in conclusion, the idea of community and civil custodianship is key. To sustaining sites of memory, to generating protection and ownership of sites, and narratives. Narratives are heritage, often not so tangible, not so easy to grasp, but mean something to people who you aren't necessarily engaging with on a day-to-day basis. And our job and the role that we played and continue to play is to listen, to make space for people to be heard, and to recognize as custodians that those are the people who lived the events and made contributions. And even if it was beyond their lifetimes, the memories, the oral history is something that is often lost as we focus on more physical assets. But when you do find the physical asset, how will this site be maintained as a site of memory? Steve Biko's grave is in King Williamstown, and everybody, whoever's driven through King Williamstown, has driven pretty much straight over it, and yet we don't know that it's there. So I hope it wasn't too much of a dreary tone, but this project has really opened up our eyes to the history of Duncan Village and the challenges and the fact that this place appears to have been left behind, and yet there are jewels that just need to be uncovered. And the way to do that is to engage with people, as well as our archives, as well as the other sources of information. The people are the heritage, their stories, their lives, the music, the theater, the drama, the struggle heroes, the natural history plays a role, and all of these things can be recognized. And the challenge is then translating that into a physical site where you can recognize and present a narrative, not necessarily for the external party, but for those that are in the area, for those that have potentially lost that knowledge. And with that, I thank you and look forward to any questions or comments.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gilliam. So, for that evocative and rather somber presentation, but you certainly told us a lot about the tangible and intangible jewels of Duncan Village, which was basically an eye-opener. But in any case, thank you very much. Just before I take any questions, I'd like to just read a couple of chats that appeared in the chat box. From Patricia Emmett, excellent presentation, thank you. From Mishka Collier, thanks to the thoughtful presentation. Yes, and then Andre Friskill says, very depressing conclusion of the Alcott Gwenshaw Memorial Site. And then Frank Wright says, bravo, good work. Well, there we go. So that I think is a good summary of your, as I said, evocative and challenging presentation. So, colleagues, are there any questions at this point in time?
Chair, if I may, I see there is a question in the chat box from Mishka. Could I
yes.
talk to that?
Yes, certainly. Go ahead.
So the question is, in terms of heritage in an area where people have a lower economic background, how do you mitigate or toe the line between heritage as a benefit to the community and something that may cause unnecessary red tape to residents? Thank you for the question. It is something that we continue to battle with. In terms of the red tape and how you toe the line between heritage as a benefit and heritage that is the red tape attached to that. I think the intangible components of that heritage that I've scratched the surface and spoken to 50 different community members is inherently valuable to them, and we should look at it in the same light. I think it's about creating structures around that, and the fence as an example. I don't know, fencing something off sometimes is the only way that you can protect it. But we need to look at how else we could protect a site using, the built environment. And I think rejuvenating these spaces, which have for 30 and 40 years been sites of resistance and resilience, not by choice. You just have to make it work. You have to continue to fight. So in terms of how we might recognize that value and turn the intangible into a tangible asset to the people, how do we bring the benefit out? What we've looked at is to propose a number of business cases along these routes, and that is where you have these jewels, where you have the St. Peter Claver Church. You know, those are assets which we cannot let wane. We need to support that, and if anything, to bring tourists into the area, you know, that's a great starting point. When you talk about the Duncan Village Heritage Museum, you know, they've gone and done that by themselves. They've opened up a museum and started to collect those historical photographs and sites themselves. So it really is a challenge, and I wouldn't say I have all the have a hard and fast answer. You know, this is really a challenge, having worked on other heritage sites in places like Langa and the Red location in Port Elizabeth, and even somewhere like the Grand Parade. You know, how do we bring an intangible heritage and translate it into a tangible benefit to those who are the custodians of that heritage? And so being a practitioner, you almost have to embed yourself into that and not separate yourself and try and, you know, walk a mile in the shoes, if that answers your question.
Thank you for that. Yes, thank you. That response. Any more questions? William, yes.
Thank you. Gillum, I'm speaking here from East London, and I'm just wondering if you're planning to include on these routes that you're setting up the 1941 namestone in Duncan Village, which you might or might not know, is completely surrounded by a dense informal settlement.
So we are aware of it, and I think at the time we couldn't actually access it. I would defer to Brian on that as the specialist, but I believe it is in our inventory. How we went about it was to drop a geolocator or like geo pins on all of the assets, but I'll take a note on it and just go and confirm that, because I know of the site, but I actually can't recall now. There were so many sites, but yeah, thank you for that. We'll definitely make sure to make sure that it's included on the route. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I can't see any more hands, people wanting to ask questions. I think we can now proceed to our fifth and last presentation, which is a combined between Brian McKenzie and Brendan Hart. First of all, Brian, career experience is, Brian was selected as one of the 200 most influential young South Africans in the Mail and Guardian Top 200. He was nominated for the 2012 Coliseum Award. He served on the Provincial Heritage Resources Authority in Gauteng and is a trustee of the Johannesburg Heritage Foundation and member of the Heritage Plans Committee. Also, then Brendan Hart, his education qualifications, architectural degree from Wits University, and a master's in the conservation of the built environment from UCT. He has career experience as an architect, which combines architecture research, conservation, and advocacy with projects that respond to the rich and complex history of the country. He has awards winning projects, which includes the new Delville Wood Memorial. It got an SAAR Award of Excellence, the restoration of Alton Court, a Tokomomo International Award, restoration of the Workers' Museum Cottage, a GIFA Award, and the restoration of Merchant Keep, which is a PRA award. Their title for the paper is "What is Heritage and Conservation Practice in Johannesburg Now?" And they say that heritage and conservation practice is guided by international charters and guidelines which define what is considered international best practice. And they aim to explore in a discussion as how to practice conservation in a challenging and dynamic city like Johannesburg. So that is what we'll hear as the last paper. Sorry, before I ask them to go ahead, I'm just reminded from Grace, who manages the APHP Secretariat, that there is a link in the chat box, please, for you to fill in and then to register as attending the symposium. So as before you leave, the link is in the chat box. So please all register with this link. Thank you. So yeah, Brian and Brendan, would you go ahead, please, with your presentation? Thank you.
So much. Thanks, everyone. So let me share our screen. Okay, I'm assuming that you can see our screen. Thank you. I'll take the silence as a yes. Okay, so Brian and I are going to be presenting as per the introduction, what is heritage and conservation practice in Johannesburg now? And we're going to present it as a discussion, and we don't have formal conclusions, but it's more something that us as practitioners have been chatting about and grappling with in terms of practicing in the very tough environment of Joburg in terms of heritage practice and conservation practice.
I think Joburg is quite a unique animal, although I suppose we all think our environments in South Africa are unique, in that we have, especially in the inner city, such rich historical fabric, and you've got really big constraints in terms of budgets, often very small budgets, and then also looking at usage of buildings and the types of uses that go into those buildings, how to get them used, and through use, how to conserve those heritage assets as well.
So our talk really has come out of this idea of what it means to practice conservation in a place like Johannesburg versus what is your typical practice of conservation, what is sort of considered international best practice. And part of it has come out of frustration because, as Brian said, we are bound by incredibly difficult budgetary constraints, buildings that are abandoned, dilapidated, neglected, and really trying to find a way to navigate this and almost try and interrogate what it means, and is there some alternative as to what conservation practice could mean?
So I think a good example of that sort of difficult fit of heritage is a building like the Rissik Street Post Office in downtown Joburg. So it is the only remaining example of ZAR, Dutch Republic architecture in Johannesburg. It's had a very checkered sort of recent history and been vacant, I think, since 1996. And eventually there was a fire in 2007, and then there was this sort of push to try to restore the building, but in the kind of classical sense of restoration. So part of the building has been really beautifully restored. There's been, various restoration of things like sandstone and the roof and windows, but because it's a city of Joburg project and budgets are an issue and use is an issue, as with so many things in Joburg, the building has kind of stalled halfway. there's no use. It seems sort of tenuous as to whether they'll manage to actually get a proper restoration off the ground. And now you've got this beautiful resource that's kind of languishing.
And it's just a shell. I think there's no internal flaws. And this is part of the issues that we're grappling with, where this has been approached as a sort of conservation first, conservation driven. And in a way, what we're to a certain extent interrogating is the priority list. I think it's come up in a number of the speeches and discussions today is how do you prioritize? And in a case like this, in the context of Joburg, conservation was the priority, and the building has stalled and has been empty and has been derelict for decades. And we're arguing for perhaps, I don't know, it's probably a slightly more pragmatic approach that is by no means a purist conservation approach, but we're driven by this sort of desire to actually get the stuff done, maybe rather than be these purists in terms of how the work is achieved.
And I think one of the most important things for the conservation of a building is to look at the use of the building. So, you know, if you spend in a city like Joburg, I think the budgetary number that's been floated around with Rissick Street Post Office is somewhere in the region of 250 million rand for a restoration, which is really odd when your city has an incredibly constrained budget. And for me, the biggest question is the city wanted to spend 250 million on this building, which is fantastic because, you know, you're looking after a heritage resource, but there's no sustainable use for the building. So they haven't looked at how they program the building. So there's this grand idea of kind of, let's do an envelope restoration. Let's look at the sandstone and the beautiful timber work, and let's look at the clock tower, you know, and the detailing. But what are you going to use the building for afterwards? And if you don't have a use for a building and it becomes this kind of mausoleum, it's also not sustainable. So you're not actually looking at a sustainable life for the building and for the city around it as well.
And I think often in conservation practice, there's this idea of compatible reuse. So this idea of finding the right use to fit the building. But I often think in the context that we're dealing with, any use is better than no use. And we have multiple very important historic buildings. We're currently sitting in the CBD at the moment and looking out of the window at a collection of very beautiful Art Deco buildings, all of which are standing empty because there is no use for them. So it's this mind shift in terms of what it means to conserve, where perhaps use becomes your priority over traditional best practice. So the way Brian and I thought of discussing this is to look at a handful of projects that Brian has been involved in and I've been involved in my practice with Yasmin Myatt, and to try and see what has worked, what hasn't worked, to try and tease out possible ways of going forward. So we're going to start off with a project that was undertaken in my practice, and it's a restoration. The building is Aiton Court. It's a 1930s international style modernist building located in Hillbrow in Johannesburg. So to give you a sense of context and the reality is, Hillbrow is an incredibly tough urban environment. It is notorious, it is infamous, people might say, for the toughness of its urban environment. It is an environment where you're getting many significant early modernist buildings in terms of their architectural significance. You also have a lot of social significance in the area. It's one of the first areas in South Africa to illegally desegregate post during apartheid. But it is also an area where you've got sort of vertical urban slums. You've got hijacked buildings. You've got a massive population of illegal immigrants. It's an incredibly hard environment to work in. So the question really is, how do you work with conservation ideals in an environment like this? So this is a picture of Aiton Court in 2012 when we were approached. So when we were approached, the building had been purchased by a new property owner who purchased the building solely because they owned the building next door, and this was pulling down their rentals. And the building had been hijacked. It was occupied illegally, and for various reasons had probably not been maintained in any means for a couple of decades, if that. So you can see the state of the building that we are looking at when we arrive at the building in 2012. It is heavily decayed. It is spalling concrete. It is dilapidation. It is squatted. It is in a very bad state. Now, if you approach this from a purist conservation point of view, which people had tried to get this building restored in the past, it was saying incredibly culturally significant building, internationally published at its time, highly regarded amongst the architectural community in South Africa and internationally. And there was many attempts at these sort of more purist restorations, but they came to a stop because in the context we're talking about, everything has to be driven by what is financially feasible as low-cost inner-city housing. And also in the context we're dealing with, the client that we're talking about has zero interest in heritage and is only interested in the bottom line and the return on investment. So similar to maybe some of the stuff that Helene was talking about earlier, it's saying we're using the sort of financial side as a means to motivate for the restoration. So we're saying, instead of speaking to the client about heritage value, instead of all of that, we are using the finances and the functionality of the building as the driver, but using those as means to empower and enable a restoration. So this just gives you a sense of the building's context, a little bit about its history, designed in 1937 by these early pioneering modernist architects, Bernard Cook and Angus Stewart. As I said earlier, very widely internationally published, published in all of the architectural magazines in Europe and the Americas at the time, published in a number of books, very highly regarded as a pioneering piece of modernist architecture. In the 1980s, it became a hotbed for political operatives in terms of the apartheid struggle, housing struggle that was happening in the city at the time, but it falls into the state of disrepair. Here's some more images that we gathered through the historical research of the building at the time. Now, you've got all of this, you can say it's the weight of history of this building, but the reality is the money is almost non-existent. So it's using financial decisions and heritage decisions in parallel to try and find a way to make the project happen. So our approach in this was to look at it as a repair job, in the respect that repair is often cheaper than replacement. It's not about perfection in any means. So the building by many standards would probably be considered quite rough. There's many imperfections. There are many compromises that have to be made, but it's trying to achieve the best possible result with the smallest possible budget. And when I'm saying small budgets, I think the budget per apartment was 14,000 Rand. It is ridiculously small budgets, but it's using that and motivating from a heritage point of view to try and enable something to happen. So you can see here, balancing that significance. We balance the architectural significance and use that as a reason to restore it, but from a client point of view saying, it's cheaper if we repair, let's not make major changes, we can get this done quickly, let's stick with what is there, let's use the logic of the building, let's spend money where it makes sense to spend money. And in this case, that's protecting the envelope and restoring the public spaces in the building. So it's really understanding that you have to get of what the building's value and significance is, and adding value where the value needs to be. So here, the major thing was restoring public spaces, because that is, we felt, added the highest return in value and investment for the building's cultural significance and value.
Another one that's kind of similar, and I know William Martinson's on the seminar as well. So it's a building that William is very familiar with, is the Anstey's building, also in downtown Joburg, and also a really difficult sort of financial financial model to master. So Anstey's was built in 1936, so it's a similar age to Aitson, and suffers from the same sort of issue of the massive capital flight out of the CBD. When Anstey's was built, it was the tallest building in Africa. It was this kind of very luxurious apartment complex with a quite lavish downstairs general dealer, almost, you know, in the kind of vein of like a Harrods or Harvey Nicks, called the Anstey's, Norman Anstey and Company. And the building was actually slated for demolition in the late 80s, early 90s, when there was still some pressure in the CBD for property development. So kind of before the basically complete collapse of the inner city area of Johannesburg. And so there was a request made to the National Monuments Council to demolish Anstey's by the property owner, and that request was declined by, at that stage, the National Monuments Council. And I think William was quite involved, and people like Flowbird as well. And ultimately what happened is the building was saved and sectionalized, which was probably a bad idea, and protected as this sort of public monument to the Art Deco period in downtown Joburg. You kind of fast forward sort of 20 years down the line from the early 90s, or 15 years down the line, and you have a building that, you know, although there's really good intentions on every side, for sectional titles in Joburg are incredibly difficult to manage, and the building has kind of slipped into quite a severe state of decay. So I mean, these pictures give you an idea of just how lavish it was when it was new. So there's a lovely image there of the tea terrace and people kind of having their teas, and waiters in you know, hats and sachets, and there we go. So this is kind of the state of the building in the early 2000s. So, you know, definitely not lacking in love, but lacking in a little bit of repair and maintenance. So there were major issues along the facades with spalling, issues with waterproofing, and, you know, being a sectional title building, or when you have a single property owner, you can go to a bank and say, look, we want to raise capital and we want to do a refurb project. It's very difficult to get capital as a sectional title. And so we kind of sat with this issue where there were a number of owners in the building who really loved their flats. And in fact, most of the people who lived in the building loved living there as well. But you have a building that's kind of degrading in real time, and it's really difficult to sort of imagine what to do. And much at this time, I mean, so part of that sort of process was also like reimagining the building and getting residents to re-engage. So we started an inner city arts NGO called Urban Arts Platform. So you can see some of the performances we did, and really got people in the building much more engaged with the way that they function in the space. So even though the building's still sort of falling down around you, you start to create a space that people are aware of. There was quite a lot of media attention around the building at that stage. And then we started to imagine what we could do. We were also quite fortunate, you know, this is kind of around about 2010, where the inner city seemed like it was going to pull straight, and people were starting to come back into town. People with money were starting to come back into town. And suddenly there was this buzz that Joburg was going to become something really special. And Anstey's was sort of almost at the heart of that. At the same time, Wessel de Jong from Docomomo was in South Africa, and he came to see Anstey's. And, you know, I think to give you just a total idea of the disconnect between conservation in Europe and conservation in South Africa, Wessel told me about the Hilversum Sanatorium, which is a beautiful modernist building. And, you know, they'd also had an issue. The building had fallen into disuse, and it was very expensive to repair, because quite often, or not repair, but to restore. If you're going to restore an important building, the cost of restoration is not less than X of a new building. It's X plus plus plus. So, you know, Wessel said, well, you know, what they did was they costed a new build. And then obviously this was kind of 3 or 4 times the price of the new build. So they went to the Dutch government and they said, look, we're going to restore this public monument. So we'll spend the X that, or our developer will spend the X that it would cost for a new build. And the Dutch government said, that's great. We'll give you all the extra money. So Wessel said to me, this is really what you should think about for Anstey's. And I was incredibly depressed at the end of the conversation. But what we actually realized you could do is you can kind of eat an elephant piece by piece. And so, you know, we started this process of gradually restoring the building as we had funding, and sort of being involved in the body corporate also meant that we could manage the building slightly better than what it had been managed for like the previous 15 years. And so we started to ring fence money. It was also with the city starting to pull itself straight, the building started to generate more income than it had been generating previously. And so we pushed that income into piecemeal restoration of the building. Also, like Helene was talking about, you know, we scraped back the original paint. So I'm just looking at our time. You must hurry me if I need to hurry, Brendan.
I think you're fine.
So we scraped the colors back. I think in the 80s, they'd painted it this kind of dirty salmon in this kind of idea of what a deco building should look like from Miami. But when we got it back, it had originally been this beautiful concrete finish. So we got a special color. It's actually called Anstey's Gray. So we had the paint mixed. I mean, it's a fairly close match to what it was originally. And then we looked at some sort of colorized photographs and we tried to get a sense of what the building had been. And, you know, if we'd waited for like a full project team and a full costing and a full heritage spec, and if we'd gone with best practice on this, Anstey's would still be sitting on JP Street, basically degrading. But because we just kind of tackled it piece by piece, we ended up with, I mean, there's still a litany of issues in Anstey's, and I mean, William is well aware of these, but we ended up with a building that has been, I hope, protected in a sustainable way, you know, for future generations, which is ultimately what you want to be doing with these heritage buildings. So that is the exterior of the building. We've got the lovely terrazzo on the bottom. It's also had a little bit of a rough and ready restoration on the terrazzo because that had started to spoil as well. And then you can see that lovely concrete gray color up on the building above the street level. Even on the canopy, there was actually this really terrible steel signage that had been tacked all over the canopy. When we removed the steel signage, we actually found the original black glass of the Anstey's building on the side of the canopy. And you can see, if you brave and you go up to the edge, you can actually see where the Norman Anstey and Company was in gold on that black glass as well. So, you know, again, you're not over restoring, you're not removing that beautiful patina and the story of the building. And the fact that, you know, it was once a luxurious building and now it's in quite a rough and ready part of town. This is also just a little bit of an idea of some of the interior spaces. So looking at the lobbies, you know, obviously it would originally have been in like a vinyl on the floor. We did like a porcelain, but we looked at the same sort of proportioning and the design that would have been in the original building, even the staircases that we reinstated, the Anstey's monkeys, which have now been stolen. But, you know, those were kind of had pride of place in the building. And then some of the apartments that we've also looked at kind of working with what's there. So working with your beautiful parquet and your really lovely sort of quite chic modernist interiors, not working against that, and looking at how to sort of reimagine the spaces of the building.
I think what's interesting about the Anstey's example is typically it's restore the building and have the function happen in it. But what's interesting in the Anstey's example is you activate the building first, even in its dilapidated state, get people to want to value the building, and then do the restoration. And even if it's rough and ready, it's the better alternative. And I think what practice in conservation Joburg has taught me, I'm sure yourself as well, is you can't be precious. Yeah. And often something is better than nothing. So just looking here at the next example is the Workers' Museum cottages. So these are owned by the city of Johannesburg. They are part of a former Workers' Museum compound, which is a former workers' hostel relating to municipal workers in Johannesburg. So part of this quite difficult apartheid history of the inner city. And the Workers' Museum is at the former hostel that has been converted into a museum. And these two cottages adjacent to it, you can see them here in sort of these historical contextual photos, were part of the sort of the power plant that sort of literally drove the city at that time. So this sort of industrial side of the city. Now, in the case of these buildings here, they had fallen into a state of disrepair, and worse than that, had a botched, very expensive attempt at a restoration happen to them. So there was a quite a substantial budget, and the contractor ran off with half the money. The building was substantially stripped, and then it was left in a state of disrepair. So we were approached by the city at this point in time to say, we've got a very small budget. And when I say small budget, we're not talking multiple millions. We're talking about a very small budget that is finite in terms of time and fixed in terms of what is possible. And we need to spend this, otherwise it disappears in terms of city budgeting. And also we need to make these spaces usable, because if they're not usable, they might as well not exist if you look at the post office. So this is just to give you a sense of the context of the site when we arrived. The buildings had been hoarded off for many years. The site itself had just piles of garden refuse. Internally, the buildings had been stripped and gutted. So you can see internally they were completely unusable. To a certain extent, you could say just falling apart and open roofs, leaking pipes. But
we saw them as pra, and I think we thought that they were basically written off. It was really touch and go.
So it's in a state, but there were still elements. There's still some interesting things. So sorry, the slides are skipping by themselves for some reason. What is interesting is we thought about how we're going to do this. How can we possibly look at doing something meaningful with these buildings. And really what it was is this balance between cultural significance, budget, and functional value. And I can't emphasize the functional value more, because without function, regardless of what that function is, I would almost say, these buildings are not going to be protected. So in the case of this building, we actually worked in reverse. So we worked and said, this is the budget. The budget is capped. This is our priority list in terms of the restoration. We can only do work to the value of the budget. How can we stretch this as far as possible? So we did things like recycling materials, reusing the building waste, reusing things that had been left over from other projects. These are sort of leftover bollards, old windows, all of these elements to try and stretch the budget as far as possible. But also we're using this as a guide for the project. So it wasn't guided by what is conservation best practice as much as it was by how much can we get for our money, always with that sort of idea of the heritage value in the background. So using contractors who know how to work with what is there. So using the motivation of repair over replacement, even if it's maybe not absolutely historically correct. If there's a handle and it works, you repair it. If there's a window and it works, you repair it. To try and, battery's running low, hold 1 second. To try and, as best as possible, bring the building back to this functional state within this very tight budget and tight timelines. So what you end up with afterwards, we were very pleased with how the project turned out, because we managed to stretch the budget as much as possible. We managed to try and create these spaces that are usable, but also still spoke to the heritage value and cultural significance of the site. So the cottages, while the Workers' Museum behind it was for the Black municipal workers, the cottages housed the skilled white supervisors and workers. So they speak about this messy, complex history of South Africa at that time, of Joburg at that time. But we felt it was important that they continued to have this dialogue. So there's this very simple restoration on the outside. We called in favors to do landscaping. We recycled bricks, we recycled bollards, we recycled all of these elements to try and create the spaces and the landscape that added value to the site. And internally, we embraced the mess of what were the previous alterations. We're not restoring the spaces back to where they are. So where a wall had been stripped of its plaster, we kept it as having plaster that was stripped. Where there were new openings created in a wall, we tried to figure out how to reprogram the space so that we had to do as little construction work as possible. So the building is almost this layered story of its trauma, if that makes sense. And then interpreting it and adding value where we can. The colors were layers that were scraped away from previous alterations to the building to uncover some original colors. We managed to squeeze a small amount of arts budget out of the city and used that to commission local artists. This was during COVID. So we managed to squeeze a little bit of money out of the city's arts budget to commission 50 small artworks that speak to workers in the city that became part of a permanent collection and were framed in the recycled window frames in the building. So it's all about this adding value and layering so that the building's significance increases, even though it might not have been as carefully protected and restored and repaired as you would want to typically. And where there is something of significance, original features, trying to really enhance that as much as possible.
And then also on a similar kind of vein, the restoration or the repurposing of the Victoria Yards in Lawrenceville, Johannesburg. So this was a very interesting project. I wish I could say I was the architect of the project. There was no architect. It's kind of almost like a passion-driven project by a Joburg developer called Brian Green, who is quite a sort of visionary in like taking these spaces that are sort of slightly gritty and unloved and reprogramming them and giving them new lives. So his sort of first big project was 44 Stanley. And then he started working on what was the old New York steam laundries in Lawrenceville, which is also quite a sort of rundown area of Joburg, but across the road from the head office of Nando's. And it was also interesting for me because I'd worked on the sort of reconstruction of the Rand Steam Laundry site in Richmond, which is now, and Brian actually operates that as well. It's now called Rand Steam, and it's like a sort of shopping center node that was illegally demolished by Imperial, and then also through massive pressure from very, very dedicated people in the heritage sector in Joburg. There was this, actually not even just a drive, but the developer had to reconstruct the buildings on the site. So having looked at the Rand Steam Laundries, it was very interesting to see another steam laundry along a stream, also from the early part of Joburg. So we kind of got this massive load of drawings that defined the sort of various layers and histories of the site that had been a laundry. And by the time that we got there, it was kind of mainly motor mechanics. Everything was covered in grease. The buildings had been knocked around to a state where, you know, it was very difficult. We managed from the site plans to identify which each building was, but it was difficult to see which building had been which. And then it was a question of looking at, you know, what is an appropriate use? What's an appropriate way of inhabiting these buildings? And actually, the uses of the buildings have changed so much over their lives. And as industrial buildings, they are these rough and ready buildings. So part of the importance of the building, someone earlier was talking about the sort of 80s idea of, you know, faithful restoration back to what the building had been when it was new. And absolutely, that was not the approach here. The history of the sort of trauma and the different uses of the building was really important. So we wanted to highlight, you know, different little additions onto the buildings, and then to re-inhabit them and reuse them in line with that same narrative. So, you know, it's not a point where you have, well, this is the point of the beginning of the project and this is the point of the end of the project. You just become part of the history of the use of these buildings. So to that sort of end, we looked at things like the significance, which Steve was talking about, and things that made the buildings significant were things like the relationship between the buildings, the patina of the buildings, the story of the buildings, the spaces between as well. So it's not just looking at your building in isolation, it's looking at, you know, the kind of walkways and squares and roads, and then from that, we created a set of guidelines. So again, it's not a question of a sort of very defined design for what Victoria Yards will be. This is kind of the design. This is what's stamped. This is what it ends up as. You don't touch it. It was more like a very rough and ready sort of manual. So when you want to repurpose a building, these are the things that are important. You know, your steel windows, your red brick, the patina on the brick, your kind of the roof, the corrugated sheeting, the fact that you can see into the structure of the building, the open space, the spaces between. You can't go and kind of roof the whole thing over, and, you know, so it's really what makes this a significant space, rather than a sort of nitty-gritty, very rigorous, you know, this is, you can't move outside of the. And then from those guidelines, the developer actually had like almost like a sort of a free rein to go and work within the guidelines and create this beautiful space. And I mean, Brian really did a spectacular job. So just looking at, you know, this is almost on the left is kind of the beginnings of the project. It's already been cleaned substantially. It was much worse at the very beginning. And, you know, there were guys fixing cars and there was oil everywhere. And Brian was kind of running up and down and saying, don't drive so fast, to what now has become this beautiful community space. And I think also in looking at use and looking at ownership, you know, it's not this kind of over gentrified space where you're kind of saying we're developing a space for people from the northern suburbs. It's much more a space about training people in the area, giving them ownership of the space. There's a community garden at the heart of the project, which was also Brian's idea. And you bring local people in, you give them skills, you start to uplift the whole area around as well. And through uplifting Lawrenceville, you're also ensuring the sustainable protection of heritage resources, not only in Victoria Yards, but surrounding that area as well. And then this is just kind of what Victoria Yards has become. So they have a market once a month on a Sunday, which is when your kind of, you know, northern suburbs people come into Victoria Yards, but they are definitely not the most important user of the space. And then you've got these lovely ideas of these community gardens. You've respected, you know, the openness. You've still got the streets that you had between the steam laundries buildings. You can see, you know, the beautiful stories on the walls of the buildings. But again, people have re-inhabited them in a contemporary way. So there's murals on the buildings because you've got artists in the spaces. And definitely these are not the kind of buildings. I mean, you are lucky because they're not buildings that you have to be precious with. It's not like working with the Union Buildings or the Rand Club or something. But I think it is very much about, you know, adapting buildings to the contemporary life of the city in a way that makes them sustainable, that makes people feel that they have ownership of the spaces. It's not just this monument that is detached from the community. And through doing that, you actually ensure that these will become sustainable spaces. And, you know, that story of preservation is not a story that starts, okay, our project started in October and the restoration and preservation finished, you know, in November of the following year. It's an ongoing process and it's part of the history of the building.
And I think what's interesting with a lot of these projects is there's not a predetermined outcome. I think that's perhaps quite hard to take, perhaps as a heritage practitioner, is you don't necessarily know what the final plan will be. And in Victoria Yards, it's going to evolve 100 times. So in a way, the role of the heritage practitioner is almost like a living conservation management plan, where the practitioner is constantly engaging at a very basic level to ensure that things are done as best as possible. But it's not a sort of, this is the end, sign off, submit your completion certificate to your PRA, because it's never complete.
It helps when you have a good client, I think, who has a, you know, some clients have an innate sense of how to deal with heritage, and you give them the guidelines and it kind of excites them, because this is, whereas some clients look at it and they're just like, oh, you know, so I think having a great client is also, and in Victoria Yards, it really was a fantastic client.
But I think the practice of conservation in Joburg, and particularly these grittier parts of Joburg, I think it's really about the living aspect of the heritage, that the buildings are lived spaces. And I almost feel that is as significant as the cultural value and the heritage significance, because without the one, you cannot have or protect the other.
No, you can't. It becomes unsustainable. You end up with a building like the Rustick Street Post Office, where you've spent fortunes on limited restoration. And even if they've done the full restoration, it would still be this monument that's kind of divorced from the city around it. And then it's not sustainable, it's not looked after, and people don't feel an ownership of the project.
So I think in a way what we're saying is it's a much more pragmatic approach. It's use is incredibly important. And if a building's not used, it's not going to be protected, regardless of how important it is. And just it's pragmatic. You need to constantly weigh up. I don't know about you, but you constantly have clients wanting to make changes, adaptations, and it's weighing up those judgments all the time.
Yeah, I think it's a give and take. Like when another heritage architect I worked with, Candice Keeling, right at the beginning of our practice, you know, her thing that she'd always say to the client was, there's a give and take, you know, there's a line, and maybe you've got to give us a little bit more than you wanted to give us on the side, and then maybe there's got to be some compromise as well, because you have to ensure that the building is used. I think it's, you know, that's such an important thing, the contemporary use of the building and the contemporary life of the building as well.
And I think the other side is also that the practitioner you need to work with your client. I think there's always this impression that heritage is very dogmatic and static, but if you're not engaging in that process, it's just nothing happens. And I think the stasis is the biggest problem that we have in a city like Joburg. Is it's not like Cape Town, where you've got development pressures. We've got the complete opposite, where it's a lack of any development, of any ownership of these spaces, that is the major problem. I'm going to stop our share, and I see there was a number of comments, but I don't know if perhaps people want to ask questions before we look at the chat.
Yes, I think go ahead. Anybody wants to ask questions? I must say, it was very refreshing to hear you, discuss with each other. It was like, I felt as though I was with you in your environment. And that's quite amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and the comments also, I think you'll see the comments in the chat box. Everybody thoroughly enjoyed them, and there were some interesting comments also. The one from, if I may just pull out, from Gavin McLaughlin. This presentation makes me think of the great difference between heritage interventions in our context and in the rich countries. That is very, very, very important. So we just have to be more careful and inventive. And I think that this was the point that you were making, exactly that. Yeah, thank you, Gavin, for that. So you can see the other comments for sharing your exciting projects with us.
So I think maybe just to respond to Gavin's comment, I think that is incredibly true in terms of the budget, but I think often there's the sense of it's so sad that we don't have the budget, but I think we need to rephrase how we look at it or shift our mind to say we don't have the budget, but how can that be an asset? How can that force us to become more creative professionals and find more interesting ways to conserve and protect than throwing our hands up and saying, well, there's no money, it can't be done.
So it's like working on a really difficult site. Sometimes you get a much better project when your site is really tight and you've got these constraints and you've got to look at doing things differently rather than kind of being given a huge budget and an easy building to work with.
Yes.
I think sometimes the kind of, you know, the creative solutions make for much richer projects. Maybe that's just an architect's way of looking at things, but yeah, I think a challenge is not necessarily a bad thing. And again, it comes back to what Steve was saying, really looking at the significance of a building. What makes the building significant? What is the kind of essence of that building? How do we protect that and enhance that? And then the things outside of that, outside of what's significant, those are things that really become a little bit more sort of, you know, that's where your give and take.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. I see, Stephen, is your hand up for a question? Stephen, would you go ahead?
Yeah, a couple of points and a question. Obviously, all very nice projects, fantastic, and congratulations. They look wonderful, all of them. Some of them are quite different from the others because the let's call it the architectural or art of architecture significance is high, and in the others, you know, they're fairly robust buildings of sort of thing. But I think one of the things you said right at the beginning is any use is better than no use, and
Yes.
that's obviously the crux. And kind of your story, kind of you started off with the one with no use, and it emphasizes exactly what your attitude to what you're doing. And I think what you said about your clients, I presume, also, yes, dead on. My question is, did you have, what was your relationship or what was the process in each of these cases with the authorities?
Okay. So I think you almost need to develop a way of creating these applications that give you as much scope for engagement. So I don't know about you, Brian, but I suspect that a lot of the Section 34 applications that we submit are probably somewhere floating between a Section 34 and a conservation management plan, where the Section 34 almost becomes like a set of guidelines and methods for decision making rather than a clear-cut final product. All of the projects get approved and submitted to Provincial Heritage Resources Part 10, but we're not in an environment where the work is policed in any means. So a good end product is really up to the practitioner's sort of professional diligence and care, because I've been in private practice in Joburg for 12 years. I've as yet to have a provincial heritage official visit a building.
Yeah, it's I mean, and the authorities can be sometimes they kind of understand the project. So I was really lucky with Victoria Yards. You know, I don't know how I managed it, but I got an approval from PRA for a set of guidelines and a very basic sort of site scheme. So these are the things that we will retain. These are the heritage buildings. This is the way that we're working within the scheme, but there's not a full set of kind of working drawings because they just don't exist for the project. And the provincial authority was happy with that. They understood the project and they issued us a permit. I mean, it's a while ago now. I think I may have done a CMP so that they had a longer window to work on the project. But, you know, on the other end of that, you also get very sort of rigid kind of responses from the PRA. So like with Anstey's, there was a question around painting the building. So, you know, we've got no budgets. Yes, I'm a heritage architect, but I'm already working so much more on this project than and being paid nothing for it. So much more than, you know, what I should be. Do I need to do a full section? And in fact, the buildings are declared, it's a provincial heritage resource, a former national monument. So you should have a CMP as part of the work that you do on the building. Do I need to do a full CMP to paint the building? We literally painting like for like and stopping the building degrading, and the response from the Heritage Authority is yes, you have to make the full application. And it's just like, that's so frustrating. You're basically working against the spirit of the act. You know, the act is there to conserve these heritage resources, and instead of looking at it in a pragmatic way and say, you know, you like, no, you know, we have to tick a box. So yeah, I suppose you work the best that you can and you work around these things.
I think also increasingly the heritage community, be that the PRA, be that sort of conservation bodies, we try and have less of an adversarial relationship. So even when you're working with a conservation body, it's not that they will have comments to try and prevent your project. Everyone, I think, is trying to work towards getting stuff done. I know the limited work we've done outside of Gauteng, often it's a lot more adversarial, whereas here it's perhaps more collaborative, not always, but
I think the heritage bodies in Joburg are quite, I mean, they're great because they're like eyes on the ground. So they properly police things that the PRA doesn't police. But I think also quite often they're more flexible in understanding what the project entails, what the intentions of the project are. This is how you have to make a plan. Whereas quite often the Heritage Authority, number one, doesn't police things.
Doesn't have the capacity.
Yeah, I mean, that is ultimately what it comes down to, but then is also incredibly rigid.
So I see Gabriella Seco's question about how do you get the work done?
Yeah.
Ryan, just talk about, like, from a professional point of view, Anstey's was a labor of love.
Yeah, geez, I mean, Anstey's really was. It was, you know, I mean, I had to kind of come up with the project plan myself, how we look, and obviously it's really moved on from the sort of early points in a massive way, and there's a lot of people who've been very involved in that project now, and I've managed to step back, and actually the building has continued to kind of regenerate itself as I've taken more and more of a back seat. But initially it was like getting on the body corporate, being the architect, choosing the paint specs, even sometimes being the contractor and being there with the paintbrush. So yeah, it really is a question of getting your hands quite dirty. It's not that kind of wonderful idea of being the architect and doing a drawing in your really nice office. You kind of have to be there on the ground. But I think the great thing as well with getting sort of buy-in from the people who live in the building is that actually now the lifts are being refurbished, the whole building is being repainted on the interiors, and I'm kind of still there to keep an eye on things.
Yes.
But the guys who making stuff happen in Anstey's, it's not me anymore, which is it's quite nice to kind of see your project moving on.
And in Ayton Court, the client paid a fee, but obviously a very, very small fee. And we found creative ways to basically extend our services. So both Yasmin and myself lecture at WITS. So we made the surveying of the building part of one of the courses that we did for our history course. And we actually turned the building into a number of research papers through our academic work that, in a way, was almost a way of inadvertently cross-funding the work. So it comes through university research that gets published and gets research funding, and then enables you to sort of find these creative ways to enable a project to work where the professional fees, if they exist at all, are very small.
So it'd be great if professional heritage practitioners or architects were paid really well. And then we could buy the buildings and restore them as well.
Yeah, true. Yeah, we don't live in an ideal world. Okay. Are there any other questions? Anybody would like to ask? No. Okay. Well, I think thank you so much for that presentation, ending a wonderful afternoon of celebrating heritage. Thank you very much, guys, for that, and we appreciate what you've shown us. With that, we come we come to the end of our afternoon. We've traversed a wide spectrum, and we've looked at different facets of heritage conservation and management in Southern Africa. And I'll talk about Southern Africa because we even went to Namibia. So the first presentation by Stephen Townsend discussed and gave us a somber insight into the values and challenges with the development of cities in South Africa. Aline Potgieter shared 3 case studies of her work in the physical building environment and made the point that adaptive reuse of buildings makes good financial sense. On the other hand, Agnes Shiningwami argued that the adoption of a broader decolonized approach to heritage management, particularly related to intangible heritage, this would provide a more equitable recognition to Namibia's heritage management. The fourth paper, Brian Wintermeyer, that was presented by Gellem Brewer, gave an evocative and colorful presentation of the non-tangible and intangible jewels and heritage of Duncan Village. The focus was on having an intangible asset transformed to a tangible physical form for the community. We concluded by a combined presentation by Brian and Brendan. They discussed the challenges of heritage conservation practice and offered several suggestions using contextual examples of heritage conservation in terms of economic decisions in the inner city of Johannesburg. And I think they made 2 interesting points. Heritage must be a lived space, and it must be sustainable. And they gave us a maximum of any use of a building is better than no use. So we come to the end, as I said, of an extremely enjoyable heritage afternoon. And I want to thank on behalf of the APHP and all those of us who attended. I want to thank the 5 presenters for their contribution. And with that, I'd like to move closure of the symposium. And thank you very much for attending and presenting. And thank you very much. Thank you and goodbye.